1935. Fall asleep to Hilarious History, a ledger of grand projects and grim precedents. Written and narrated in the style of Mark Twain. This book is factually accurate and edited by a human. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. By the time the year of our Lord 1935 rolled around, humanity had grown entirely accustomed to living on a tilt. Having discovered that the economic foundations of the previous decade were about as sturdy as a tissue paper umbrella in a cloudburst, the world set about inventing a whole new set of machinery to keep the species from sliding into the abyss. It was a year of immense concrete pouring, legislative legerdemain, and the unmistakable realization that history was once again sharpening its teeth. In the great American Republic, this machinery took many shapes, but none so curious nor so profoundly counter to the natural instincts of the pioneer as the grand contrivance hammered together in Washington during the sweltering heat of August. For upwards of a century and a half, the standard American method for dealing with old age had been beautifully simple. You either worked until you dropped dead in the furrow, or you raised a formidable crop of children and treated them with sufficient kindness that they would allow you to sit by their hearth and eat their potatoes when your knees finally gave out. It was a system based on filial piety, hard winters, and the general understanding that if you failed to provide for your own winter, the grasshoppers would have the laugh on you. But by 1935, the furrow had dried up and blown away into the next county, and the children were out on the highways looking for work themselves, leaving the hearths cold and the old folks sitting on their porches with nothing to occupy their minds but the wind and the grocer's bills. Enter the federal government, an institution which had spent its youth collected mainly to deliver the mail, shoot at Indians, and squabble over tariffs, but which had lately taken a fancy to entering the benevolence business on a grand scale. On the 14th day of August, President Roosevelt put his signature to a document known as the Social Security Act. Now, to the uninitiated, this was an ingenious mechanism designed to promise every citizen a modest pension in their dotage, thereby converting the ancient virtue of filial piety into a federal bureau. It was an astonishing piece of legislative legerdemain, whereby a man was commanded to hand over a portion of his hard-earned wages to a clerk in Washington, with the solemn promise that if he managed to avoid the undertaker until his 65th year, the government would begin sending him a few dollars a month to buy tobacco and rocking chair cushions. The philosophy behind this grand scheme was as noble as a church organ, but the mechanics were purely human. In the old days, if a man was shiftless and spent his youth throwing dice and drinking corn liquor, he knew precisely what his reward would be: a cold diet of gravel and the poorhouse. The industrious man, on the other hand, saved his copper cents, bought a mule, and looked forward to an old age of dignified authority, wherein he could sit on the porch and tell his grandsons what fools they were. The new law, however, looked upon the industrious man and the loafer with the same impartial bureaucratic eye. It declared that the state would become the universal grandson, tasked with providing the rocking chair and the tobacco for everyone alike, so long as they had a number stamped upon a small card. The debate in the halls of Congress before the bill passed was a sight to elevate the spirit of any man who enjoys a good, loud dogfight. The gentlemen of the opposition arose in their majesty and declared that this was the absolute and final end of the American Republic. They swore by the bones of Thomas Jefferson that the bill would destroy the moral fiber of the nation, turn the sturdy yeomanry into a pack of soft-handed dependents, and require every citizen to wear a dog collar with his federal number engraved upon it. One impassioned orator from the West suggested that if you gave a man a guaranteed pension, he would lose all incentive to work and would spend his mature years lying under a shade tree waiting for his check while the weeds overran the corn. On the other side of the aisle, the proponents of the measure wept open tears for the aged poor and painted a picture of a new America, where every old gentleman would live out his days in a state of perpetual, well-funded serenity, untroubled by the fluctuations of the stock market or the coldness of his relations. They spoke of the act as if it were a direct revelation from Mount Sinai, missing only a few stone tablets and a burning bush. The truth, as it usually does when politicians get to hollering, lay somewhere in the mud between them. The American people, possessing that marvelous adaptability that allows them to watch a circus parade and a funeral with the same degree of interest, took to the idea with surprising speed. They did not appear to feel their moral fiber snapping. They merely looked at their diminished bank accounts and decided that if the government was going to take up the business of being a rich uncle, it would be bad manners to refuse the kinship. Of course, the machinery required to run this great engine of benevolence was something to stagger the imagination of anyone who had never seen a locust swarm. A colony of clerks was established in Baltimore, the capital city being already choked to the rafters with other alphabetical bureaus, and these clerks began the monumental task of cataloging every working soul in the nation. They invented a system of filing cabinets that stretched for miles, filled with cards and numbers, creating a parallel universe of paper where every citizen was neatly pressed, dried, and arranged by his date of birth. It was the first time the federal government had ever attempted to keep tabs on the citizenry from the cradle to the grave, and there were those who looked upon those filing cabinets with a certain cold chill, wondering what else the government might want to write down on those cards before they were through. But for the old folks of 1935, the philosophy of the matter was of small account compared to the arithmetic. The prospect of a steady $12 or $15 a month, sums that looked like a king's ransom to men who had spent 3 years trading eggs for flour, was enough to make the Federal Bureau look less like a tyranny and more like a celestial visitation. The ancient system of family dependence had been fractured by the hard times, and the government simply stepped into the breach with a fountain pen and a ledger, proving that while the state cannot give a man a loving family, it can at least give him enough groceries to keep him from having to live with his daughter-in-law. Thus, the United States took its first great step into the modern world of regulated comfort, wherein a man's future was no longer left to the erratic mercies of Providence, his own industry, or the gratitude of his offspring, but was instead guaranteed by the credit of the United States and the fidelity of an infinite army of bookkeepers. It was a grand experiment, and one that left the old ghosts of the frontier shaking their heads in bewilderment, wondering what the world was coming to when a man had to ask permission from a clerk in Maryland before he could afford to grow old and die in his own time. Chapter 2. The Afternoon the Sky Fell. Now, while the lawmakers in Washington were busy constructing that great paper fortress to shelter mankind from the winters of their 65th years, nature looked down upon the western regions of the Republic and decided to remind the human race that she still held the master lease on the territory. It is a peculiar trait of the human animal that when he occupies a piece of land for 20 years without it blowing away, he begins to believe he owns it and that he and the Almighty have entered into a permanent partnership regarding the rainfall. For 2 generations, the hardy husbandmen of the Great Plains had been tearing up the ancient buffalo grass with their iron plows, exposing a rich black loam that had lain asleep since the 3rd day of creation. They planted wheat by the millions of acres, made a great deal of money during the late war when the Europeans were too busy shooting each other to farm, and generally patted themselves on the back for their superior enterprise. They looked upon the endless prairie as a private gold mine that required nothing but a tractor and a regular turning of the sod. They quite forgot that the grass had been placed there originally for an excellent reason, namely, to hold the continent down. By the spring of 1935, the bill for this long-standing piece of vanity came due, and it was presented with a suddenness that left the inhabitants of 3 states wondering if they had somehow offended the author of the Book of Revelations. The 14th day of April, a Sabbath day, as if to add a touch of theological solemnity to the proceedings, began with a sky so clear and blue that a man might have thought himself in the middle of a Mediterranean picture postcard. The air was warm, the meadows were peaceful, and the good people of the Panhandle put on their Sunday coats and went to church to pray for rain, which had been uncommonly scarce for 4 years. They came out of the meeting houses at noon, looked at the horizon, and noticed a small, low smudge on the northern rim of the world. It looked at first like a harmless bank of fog, or perhaps the smoke from a very large train of locomotives, and nobody paid it much mind. A gentleman might have stopped on his porch to light his pipe and remark that the weather was taking a turn, but he would not have thought it necessary to secure his livestock. Within an hour, that smudge had grown until it occupied half the sky, rising up like a mountain range of solid ink, 10,000 feet high and rolling south at the speed of an express train. It was not a storm of rain or wind, as civilized men understand those terms. It was a black blizzard, the granddaddy of all dust storms, which had decided that the topsoil of Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma belonged in the parlor rooms of the Atlantic seaboard. When the monster arrived, the sun was instantly extinguished as if a thumb had been pressed against a candle. Total, absolute darkness fell upon the noonday earth, a darkness so thick and greasy that a man could not see his own hand if he held it an inch from his nose. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked and howled like 1,000 demons whose rent was past due. The air became a solid mass of flying real estate. It was not sand, which has a certain cleanliness to it, but a fine, powdery silt, as black as chimney soot and as penetrating as a guilty conscience. Every living creature on the plains was instantly seized by a panic that was entirely justified. The cattle ran in circles until they dropped from suffocation. The jackrabbits fell dead in the ditches with their lungs full of Texas loam. And the human inhabitants fled into their houses, bolted the doors, stuffed rags into the window cracks, and prayed with a fervor that they had never quite managed during the regular Sunday services. Inside the houses, the experience was something to try the faith of a saint. The dust, did not respect such trivial barriers as pine boards and plaster. It came through the keyholes, under the doors, and through the microscopic pores of the wallpaper in steady, silent streams. People sat around their kitchen tables with wet towels wrapped around their faces, looking like a convention of highly discouraged bandits, while the kerosene lamps flickered weakly through a fog of brown air. If a man took a drink of water, he found himself chewing on a mouthful of his neighbor's back 40. If he attempted to speak, his teeth gritted together with a sound that made his spine tingle. One elderly gentleman in Texas later swore that he looked out his window during a brief lull and saw a school of prairie dogs 300 feet in the air, burrowing upward to get some oxygen. That may have been a slight exaggeration, the sort of natural embellishment that comes to a man after he has spent 3 hours breathing his own barnyard. But the reality was sufficiently grand that it required no help from the imagination. The storm did not exhaust its fury in an hour or two. It kept up its terrible dance for half the night, and when the sun finally crawled back into the sky the next morning, the world looked like a landscape on the moon. The fences were completely buried. The roads had vanished beneath great, sweeping drifts of gray powder, and the fields that had been ready for the seed were stripped down to the hard yellow clay, as bare as a billiard ball. The work of 30 years had been undone in 12 hours by a north wind that had nothing to stop it between the North Pole and the Gulf of Mexico. But the most remarkable part of the business was the geographical distribution of the spoils. The wind, having gathered up the wealth of the western farmer, did not drop it all in the neighborhood. It carried it eastward across the Mississippi, over the Ohio Valley, and right into the halls of Congress, where the politicians were still debating whether the drought was a real emergency or merely a newspaper invention. On the very afternoon that a Senate committee was taking testimony on the matter, the sky over Washington turned a strange, sickly yellow, and a fine film of Kansas dust began to settle upon the mahogany desks of the lawmakers. A senator from Massachusetts reached out his finger, wiped a smear of brown powder off his documents, tasted it, and realized for the first time that the West was not merely a place on the map, but was currently airborne and entering the windows of the Capitol. It was the most effective piece of lobbying ever performed in the city. The soil spoke for itself, and within 24 hours the government discovered a sudden and marvelous enthusiasm for the science of soil conservation. They began hiring young men to plant trees by the millions, a great green wall stretching from Canada to Texas, to act as a breakwater against the wind. They taught the farmers to plow in curves instead of straight lines, which looked very untidy to the old-fashioned eye, but had the merit of keeping the rain from running off to the Gulf. It was a grand spectacle, man attempting to domesticate the weather with a spade and a book of instructions issued by the Department of Agriculture. In the meantime, the people of the plains washed their faces, shoveled the drifts off their porches, and went back to work with that peculiar dogged optimism that is either the highest form of human courage or the most advanced stage of lunacy. They joked about their misfortune because an American must either laugh at a disaster or shoot himself, and shooting took too much energy in the dust. They claimed they could tell where the wind was coming from by the color of the dirt in the butter, and they looked forward to the next year with the absolute conviction that the rain would return, the wheat would grow, and the sky would stay where it belonged. They had learned, after a fashion, that the earth is a very ancient and irritable landlord, and that if you treat her with too much familiarity, she has a way of clearing her throat and turning the parlor upside down just to show who owns the property. Chapter 3. The Dedication of the Great Concrete Plug. Now, while nature was busy demonstrating how easily she could move a continent by the shovelful, man was down in the deep trenches of the Southwest, engaged in a furious argument with a river to see who was the rightful master of the geography. The river in question was the Colorado, a wild, red, venomous snake of a waterway that had spent several million years carving out the grandest canyons on Earth and drowning anyone who had the temerity to settle within 5 miles of its banks. It was a stream that possessed no sense of civic responsibility whatever. In the springtime, when the snows melted in the mountains, it would swell up into a roaring torrent, overflow its banks, and turn the fertile valleys of California into an inland sea. By August, it would shrivel down to a muddy trickle, leaving the crops to die of thirst while it hissed softly in its canyon. For decades, the human race had looked upon this erratic monster with a mixture of awe and intense irritation. It was intolerable to the modern mind that so much water should be allowed to run sideways into the Pacific Ocean without ever turning a wheel, watering a lettuce leaf, or paying a single dollar in taxes. And so, in the late 20s, the federal authorities, having grown fond of large-scale carpentry, decided to wedge enough masonry into a desert canyon to halt the river entirely, proving that if you give a human being enough gravel and a shovel, he can alter the geography of Genesis. By the autumn of 1935, this grand enterprise was nearing its completion, and the result was the Boulder Dam, subsequently named for Mr. Hoover, though the politicians spent a considerable amount of ink trying to decide whose name deserved to be chiseled into the rock. To understand the sheer magnitude of this business, one must realize that the place chosen for the dam was a desolate, blistering hole in the earth called Black Canyon, where the summer temperature routinely reached a point that would melt the solder out of a tin pan. It was a region so forsaken by God and avoided by man that even the rattlesnakes looked discouraged. Yet into this fiery furnace the government marched an army of 5,000 men, equipped with steam shovels, dynamite, and an absolute contempt for the laws of gravity. The first thing they had to do was tell the river to move aside, a request that the Colorado received with its usual bad temper. The engineers drilled 4 colossal tunnels through the solid rock of the canyon walls, tunnels so wide that you could have driven a pair of locomotives through them side by side, and they forced the river to go around the workspace while they laid the foundations. Then began the pouring of the concrete. Now, an ordinary person might think that pouring concrete is a simple matter of mixing mud and dumping it into a hole. But when you are building a wall 700 feet high and 60 feet thick at the top, the laws of physics become uncommonly particular. If they had poured the dam all at once, the heat generated by the chemical setting of the cement would have been so great that the interior of the wall would have remained red hot for 150 years, and the whole structure would have cracked open like a dropped watermelon. To prevent this celestial catastrophe, the engineers had to invent a completely new method of architecture. They built the dam in a series of interlocking blocks, like a giant honeycomb, and inside every block they laid hundreds of miles of iron pipe. Through these pipes, they pumped water from a refrigeration plant that was large enough to manufacture an iceberg a day. They froze the concrete from the inside out, chilling the monster until it was as cold as a banker's heart. And then they pumped the pipes full of grout until the entire mass became a single, solid piece of artificial mountain. The men who did this work were known as high scalers, and they were a breed of human being that possessed no nerves whatever. They spent their days dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, holding heavy pneumatic drills against the rock, while the wind swung them back and forth like pendulums. If a loose rock fell from above, their only defense was a hard hat made of canvas and glue, which they coated with black tar to make it stiff. They treated the whole business as a species of circus performance, frequently performing acrobatic stunts on their ropes for the amusement of their comrades below, while the river boiled in the abyss beneath their boots. By the time President Roosevelt arrived in September to dedicate the structure, the dam was practically finished, and it was a sight to make a man feel very small and very proud, all at the same time. It sat there between the towering black cliffs like a great white curving crescent of smooth stone, more than 3 million cubic yards of concrete held together by nothing but its own weight and the sheer stubbornness of the human will. Behind it, the wild Colorado was already beginning to back up, smoothing out its rough edges and turning into a deep, quiet, blue lake that would eventually stretch for 100 miles into the desert. The president stood on the top of this magnificent plug, with the flags flying and the brass bands playing, and he spoke to the assembled multitude through a battery of microphones. He looked down at that immense wall of masonry and declared that it was a victory of man over the forces of nature, a monument to American industry, and a sign that the nation was no longer afraid of big things. The crowd cheered, the governors of 4 states shook hands with each other, and the engineers smiled quietly into their pipes, knowing that they had successfully handcuffed a river that had been wild since the dawn of time. The consequences of this grand project were felt almost instantly throughout the Western Empire. The water that had once spent its energy tearing up the topsoil of Arizona was now forced to pass through a series of immense steel turbines, where it was converted into electrical current. This current was sent humming across the deserts on copper wires, climbing over mountains and valleys until it reached the coastal cities of California, where it was used to turn the wheels of factories, light up the moving picture palaces of Hollywood, and run the electric ice boxes of 1 million suburban kitchens. Furthermore, the Imperial Valley, which had lived for 30 years in perpetual dread of a spring flood, suddenly found itself in possession of a regular, orderly supply of water that arrived through an irrigation ditch whenever a farmer turned a brass valve. The desert began to bloom with melons, lettuce, and oranges, proving that if you give a river a sufficient quantity of discipline, it can be made to behave like an honest, tax-paying citizen. Of course, there were those who looked upon the completed dam with a certain feeling of melancholy. The old-timers, who remembered the Colorado when it was a free and dangerous thing, felt that something grand had passed out of the world. They felt that a river that had been tamed by a committee of bureaucrats and an army of concrete mixers was no longer a true river, but merely a very large plumbing fixture. But the world of 1935 had no time for romantic sentiments regarding wild rivers. It was a world that needed power, it needed water, and above all it needed to believe that man was still the master of his own destiny. And as the tourists began to flock to the site by the thousands, driving their motor cars across the top of the Great White Wall and looking down into the dizzying depths of the canyon, they felt a reassuring sense of security. They saw that even though the banks might fail and the stock market might tumble, the great concrete plug would remain there in the desert, holding back the floods and lighting up the darkness for centuries to come, an eternal testament to the year when humanity decided to take the geography into its own hands. Chapter 4. The Financial Ruin of the Parlor Floor. While the federal authorities were busy carving their names into the everlasting granite of Black Canyon, and while the wind was busy reallocating the real estate of Oklahoma, a small fraternity of printers in Philadelphia was quietly preparing an engine of domestic destruction that would cause more arguments, more broken engagements, and more temporary family hatreds than any tax law since the founding of the Republic. It is a well-established truth that when a man has lost his actual money in the real world, his first and most pressing instinct is to find some imaginary world where he can pretend to be a millionaire at the expense of his relations. Recognizing this beautiful trait of human nature, a firm by the name of Parker Brothers chose the dark winter of 1935 to unleash a parlor game called Monopoly upon a public that had scarcely enough legal tender among them to buy a standard loaf of bread. The history of this contrivance was itself a masterpiece of human irony. It had been stitched together originally by a poor, out-of-work fellow named Darrow, who sat at his kitchen table in Pennsylvania with a piece of oilcloth, some leftover house paint, and a handful of wooden molding strips he had begged from a local carpenter. He drew a square tract, divided it into little plots of land named after the streets of Atlantic City, a coastal resort where the wealthy were accustomed to take the salt air, and invented a supply of colorful paper script that looked like real money but possessed the grand advantage of being entirely free from the supervision of the Federal Reserve. When the game first arrived on the shop counters, the wise men of commerce looked upon it with extreme suspicion. They noted that it had too many rules, took upwards of 3 hours to play, and dealt with the highly depressing subject of real estate investment at a time when half the mortgages in the country were currently being foreclosed by the banks. They told the inventor that the human race wished to be amused, not reminded of their debts. But they had entirely miscalculated the terrifying depth of the American desire for financial revenge. Within 6 months, the game had become a national delirium. Mild-mannered aunts, honest school teachers, and Presbyterian deacons who had never in their lives stolen a single copper cent from a church collection plate suddenly became ruthless, rent-gouging landlords who would cheerfully bankrupt their own flesh and blood for a row of greenhouses on Pennsylvania Avenue. The mechanics of the game were calculated to bring out every dormant spark of piracy that lies buried in the human breast. A group of 4 or 5 otherwise respectable people would gather around a green oilcloth square, and each would choose a small metal token to represent his earthly ambitions. One fellow would be a thimble, another a little iron, a third a miniature top hat. Paltry household items that gave no hint of the terrible financial ferocity about to be unleashed. Then, by the throw of 2 ivory dice, they would begin their journey around the board, buying up public utilities, railroads, and vacant lots with an indifference to cost that would have staggered a Rothschild. For the first half hour, the atmosphere was usually characterized by a deceptive Christian charity. The players would borrow money from each other, make pleasant remarks about the weather, and pass through the Go Square to receive their regular stipend of $200 with the cheerful gratitude of simple laborers receiving their weekly hire. But as soon as the land was all bought up and the first red hotels began to appear on the properties of the wealthy, the true nature of the species came to the surface. If a player had the misfortune to land upon a territory known as Boardwalk or Park Place, owned by his own mother, that lady would look upon him not with the tender eye of maternal devotion, but with the cold, calculating glare of an old-line mortgage shark. She would demand a rent of several $100s in fake currency, and if the boy could not produce the sum, she would strip him of his property, seize his railroads, and turn him out onto the parlor floor a broken and penniless vagabond, while she stacked her paper hundreds into neat, triumphant piles. The game was a perfect miniature of the great world outside, with the solitary exception that in the game a man could occasionally go to jail for a turn or two, which was considered an excellent piece of luck because it allowed him to sit quietly in his cell and avoid paying rent to his family while they prowled around the board looking for his destruction. It was a magnificent spectacle to watch a family of 6 who had lived together in perfect harmony for 20 years through sickness and health, turn upon each other over the possession of a trumpery utility like the waterworks. A husband would refuse to trade a yellow property to his wife, even though she wept open tears and reminded him of their marriage vows, because he knew that if she obtained the third piece of the set, she would instantly erect a row of houses and drive him into immediate bankruptcy before the children were in bed. The language of the game became a universal dialect. People who had never seen the Atlantic Ocean spoke of Marvin Gardens and the Short Line Railroad with the familiar knowledge of old inhabitants. They spent their evenings shouting across tables about mortgages, unearned increments, and the divine right of a property owner to double his fees if he happened to own all the lots of a single color. It was the only place in America where a man could experience the sublime satisfaction of owning a monopoly without the disagreeable necessity of being investigated by a congressional committee. The social critics of the day looked upon this phenomenon with a great deal of solemn anxiety. They wrote long articles in the monthly magazines declaring that the popularity of the game was a sign of the moral decay of the age. They argued that it educated the young in the worst practices of speculative capitalism, that it glorified the accumulation of unearned wealth, and that it encouraged a spirit of greed that was entirely un-American. But the people who actually played the game paid no more attention to these philosophers than they did to the wind in the chimney. They knew precisely why they loved the little paper deeds and the wooden houses. It was because the game allowed them to play the part of the big-bellied financier for 2 hours, without any of the troublesome baggage of real-world ruin. If a man lost all his properties on the oilcloth, he did not have to sleep under a bridge. He merely packed his thimble and his paper thousands back into the cardboard box, shook hands with his conquerors, and went to bed with the reassuring knowledge that his actual pocketbook was exactly as empty as it had been when the evening started. By the time the year drew to its close, the Parker Brothers factory was running 3 shifts a day, turning out thousands of tons of paper wealth to satisfy a public that seemed to have an insatiable appetite for the illusion of prosperity. It was a strange and beautiful paradox. The human race, having been thoroughly scorched by the realities of a global financial collapse, spent its leisure hours huddled around a lamp, happily inventing new ways to drive each other into the poorhouse for the sheer, unadulterated joy of the sport. Chapter 5. The Sovereign Decree of the Peacock Throne. It is a singular fact that when a nation has spent a few thousand years being known by one name, it feels a certain sense of injustice when the rest of the world, in its lazy and ill-informed fashion, insists on calling it by another. Such was the case in the ancient and venerable kingdom of Persia, a land of silk rugs, poets who lived on wine and moonlight, and mountains that had looked down upon the rise and fall of more empires than a man could count on his fingers and toes without a great deal of confusion. For upwards of 2 millennia, the Western world had been calling this place Persia, a name bestowed upon them by the Greeks, those tireless meddlers who had a habit of renaming everything they encountered, from the stars in the heavens to the unfortunate barbarians who had the misfortune to live across the water from Athens. The Persians, being a polite and long-suffering people, had tolerated this Greek eccentricity with the grace of an old cat allowing a toddler to pull its tail. But by the year 1935, the modern state of Persia, currently under the firm and somewhat rigid guidance of a gentleman named Reza Shah, decided that the time had arrived for a bit of linguistic housekeeping. The Shah, a man who possessed a mustache of such formidable proportions that it seemed to exert its own gravitational pull on the affairs of state, was a great admirer of the modern method. He looked at his country and saw not a dusty remnant of antiquity, but a budding industrial power that deserved to be taken seriously by the engineers and bankers of Europe. He had built railroads through the rugged passes of the Zagros Mountains. He had modernized the army, and he had spent a great deal of time looking at maps and feeling that the name Persia sounded a bit too much like a tea-time delicacy or a breed of long-haired house cat. And so, on the 21st day of March, the Persian government issued a sovereign decree that struck the world's mapmakers with a sense of sudden and profound dizziness. They announced that from that hour forward, the rest of the world was requested to kindly stop using the name given to them by the Greeks and instead refer to the land as Iran. The word itself was not a new invention. It was, in fact, the name the inhabitants had used to describe their home since the dawn of their own history. It meant land of the Aryans, a term that carried with it a great deal of ancient and honorable weight, though it did cause a bit of diplomatic eyebrow-raising in certain European capitals, where that particular word was beginning to be used in ways that were increasingly unpleasant. But for the Shah, it was a simple matter of national dignity. He wished to scrub the influence of the Greeks from his nation's stationery, and he did not see why a country should be forced to labor under a nickname provided by a people who had been out of business for nearly 2,000 years. The effect of this announcement upon the global community was one of unmitigated bewilderment. In the foreign ministries of London, Paris, and Washington, the clerks who were responsible for updating the diplomatic records suddenly found their desks littered with urgent cables requesting that all official correspondence be amended. A cartographer in London, who had just spent 6 months painstakingly hand-engraving a new set of copper plates for an atlas of the Middle East, looked at the announcement, threw his magnifying glass against the wall, and spent the remainder of the afternoon drinking dark ale in a mood of profound scholarly bitterness. It was a delightful piece of bureaucratic chaos. For weeks, the newspapers were filled with confusion. Reporters who were accustomed to writing about Persian carpets and Persian politics now found themselves writing about Iranian carpets and Iranian politics. And they did it with the uncertain air of a man walking on thin ice. The public, always eager for a bit of trivia to argue over at the dinner table, took to the change with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some felt it was a grand and noble reclamation of identity, while others complained that they had only just learned where Persia was on the map, and now they would have to start the whole miserable business of geography over again. The truth is, geography is the most stubborn and resistant subject in the schoolhouse. A man can change his name, he can change his religion, and he can even change his trousers. But to change the name of a country is like trying to convince the Mississippi River to flow upstream for the convenience of a committee of tourists. The name Persia was baked into the very language of the West. It was in the Bible, it was in the plays of Aeschylus, and it was in the advertisements for luxury rugs sold in the great department stores of New York and Chicago. To remove it from the vocabulary was a task that would require several generations and a terrifying amount of red ink. The Shah, however, was a man who did not believe in the slow passage of time. He sent out circulars to every embassy in the world, reminding them with increasing sharpness that Persia was an obsolete term, and that anyone caught using it in an official capacity would be treated as a friend of the old ways, a classification that, in the Kingdom of Iran, generally led to an involuntary and somewhat abrupt retirement from the public eye. It was a fascinating study in the vanity of nations. Here was a country that had seen the rise and fall of Cyrus, of Xerxes, and of the great poets like Hafiz, all of whom had lived and died under the name of their choosing. Yet the modern state felt that its true worth depended upon the ability to force an American schoolboy to scratch out the word Persia in his textbook and replace it with Iran. One can only imagine the conversation between the ghost of an ancient Persian satrap, a man who had once commanded 100,000 cavalrymen, and a modern bureaucrat in Tehran. The satrap would likely look at the official decree with a bemused smile and wonder why such a fuss was being made over a mere label. He would point out that the mountains, the deserts, and the spirit of the people remained precisely as they were, regardless of whether the foreigners called them by the name of their choosing or by the name given to them by a Greek schoolmaster who had never traveled further than a few leagues from the Aegean Sea. But the 1930s was a decade that set great store by these sorts of definitions. It was a time when countries were busy defining their borders, their identities, and their rights to the earth beneath their feet. The act of changing one's name was seen as a bold assertion of sovereignty, a way of telling the world that the era of being a colonial curiosity was over, and that the time had come to be recognized as a modern self-governing entity. In the end, the world adapted, as the world always does when it is faced with a demand from a government that has a loud enough voice and a sharp enough pen. Within a year, the name Persia had begun to recede into the realm of history books and antique dealers, while Iran became the official moniker for the land between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, though with a characteristic touch of irony, the government found it impossible to change the name of the Gulf itself, which remains to this day a constant source of quiet, stubborn disagreement. It was a masterclass in linguistic housekeeping, proving that if a government is determined enough, it can force the rest of the world to reorganize its mental filing cabinets. It left the geographers scrambling, the map-makers weeping, and the school teachers in a state of perpetual confusion, but it achieved the Shah's goal. It told the world that Iran was no longer a name from a library book, but a modern state with a modern ego that demanded to be spelled correctly, lest the consequences be made known in the next set of diplomatic dispatches. Chapter 6. The Invisible Eye of the Wireless Beam. While the politicians in Tehran were busy rearranging the map and the families in Philadelphia were busy ruining their nerves over cardboard real estate, a quiet, bespectacled gentleman in the British Isles named Robert Watson Watt was engaged in the altogether more serious business of making the invisible visible. It has always been the tragic flaw of the military man that he desires, above all else, to see his enemy coming from a great distance away, so that he may prepare a proper welcome of lead and fire. For thousands of years, this was accomplished by placing a fellow on a hilltop with a telescope or a spy in the bushes with a reliable horse. But in the age of the flying machine, when an airplane could travel at the speed of a startled swallow, the hilltop lookout had become as obsolete as a wooden suit of armor. Mr. Watson Watt, a man whose mind functioned like a clockwork engine of extreme precision, possessed a nagging suspicion that the radio waves which were currently busy carrying dance music and political speeches across the Atlantic could be put to a more industrious use. He had been pondering the properties of the ionosphere, that invisible, shimmering curtain of electricity that surrounds our planet, and he had noticed that when a radio beam struck an object, it behaved in much the same fashion as a sound wave hitting a canyon wall. It bounced back. He proposed with the casual air of a man suggesting a minor improvement to a toaster, that if one were to fire a continuous stream of these invisible beams into the sky, any flying machine that dared to cross the path would act as a mirror, reflecting a tiny pulse of energy back to the source. By measuring the time it took for the beam to go out and come back, one could calculate the distance of the intruder with the accuracy of a tax collector counting his coins. The government, in that state of chronic anxiety that seems to be the natural condition of ministries of defense, gave him a small patch of land on a secluded coast, a pile of vacuum tubes, and a mandate to see if he could indeed strip the skies of that most ancient military luxury, the element of surprise. The first experiments were, as is the nature of all scientific pioneering, a comedy of errors. The equipment was temperamental. The wiring looked like a bird's nest constructed by a lunatic, and the interference from the local atmosphere was enough to drive a man to drink. On one occasion, the apparatus began to register a signal so massive and fast that the team assumed they had discovered a flying machine traveling at the speed of a cannonball, only to realize they were looking at the reflection of a thunderstorm passing over the English Channel. On another, they spent an entire afternoon tracking a target that turned out to be a very large, very slow-moving swan, which had decided that the testing range was an excellent place to practice its landings. But by the summer of 1935, Mr. Watson Watt and his merry band of physicists had refined their craft to a point that would have seemed like black magic to any gentleman of the previous century. They built a chain of masts along the coast, tall skeletal towers that looked like the rib cages of prehistoric monsters, and they filled the huts at their feet with cathode ray tubes that glowed with a ghostly neon light. They called the system RDF, or Range and Direction Finding, though it would later become known to the world by the acronym radar, a word that sounds sharp, fast, and distinctly modern, like the click of a shutter or the snap of a trigger. It was, in truth, the first time in human history that a nation had managed to reach out into the empty air, grab hold of the dark, and pull an enemy out of the shadows before a single bomb had fallen. One must consider the sheer audacity of this ambition. For all of history, the sky had been the domain of the gods and the birds. It was vast, indifferent, and above all, private. A commander could launch a fleet of bombers, and so long as he stayed above the clouds or traveled under the cover of night, he was as invisible as a ghost in a cellar. He could arrive at his destination with the suddenness of a thunderbolt. But with the invention of the wireless beam, the sky was suddenly illuminated by an invisible light that never turned off. The private life of the bomber pilot was at an end. When the military high command finally came down to the coast to witness the demonstration, they arrived with the skeptical frowns of men who had seen too many scientific miracles turn out to be nothing more than overpriced stage tricks. They sat in the dark hut, staring at a green, flicking line on a screen, while Mr. Watson Watt made a series of adjustments to his dials. "If that machine works," the general remarked, with the air of a man who expects to be disappointed, "you ought to be able to tell me exactly how many aircraft are currently approaching us, and from which direction." Watson Watt did not reply. He simply turned a knob, watched the green line jump with a rhythmic pulsing light, and announced, "There are 3 squadrons of fighters, sir, approaching from the southeast at an altitude of 5,000 feet, and they are currently 15 miles out." The general walked outside, looked up at the empty blue, cloudless sky, and saw nothing. There was not a speck of dust, not a bird, not a wing to be seen in the vast, silent expanse. He turned back to the inventor with an expression of profound, deeply buried terror. He knew that if the machine could see through the clouds, the age of the stealthy raid, the surprise attack, and the midnight dash was finished. The world was being fitted with a pair of spectacles that it could never again take off. The implications of this invention were so vast that they likely did not fully register even with the people who built it. It meant that the defense of a nation no longer relied upon the courage of the watchman on the cliff, but upon the competence of the fellow behind the screen. It meant that the war of the future would be a war of signals, of pulses, and of electromagnetic shadows. It was the birth of a new kind of combat, a bloodless, silent electronic duel that took place in the nanoseconds between the firing of a beam and the return of an echo. Of course, the inventors were not thinking of the future of global conflict. They were thinking of how to keep their tubes from overheating and how to stop the local dairy farmers from complaining that the high-frequency radiation was turning their cows nervous. They were like the boys who discovered the properties of gunpowder in the Orient. They had invented a toy that promised to revolutionize the world, and they were too busy marveling at the mechanism to realize that they had just handed the human race a new way to end itself. As 1935 marched on, the secret was guarded with a jealousy that would have made a medieval alchemist blush. Men were sworn to silence under pain of immediate unpleasant consequences. The equipment was camouflaged with chicken wire and dried leaves, and the very existence of the invisible eye was kept from the newspapers, the public, and even the junior officers in the service. It is a curious and ironic reality of our species that we spend our time building great cathedrals of science just to protect our homes from our own inventions. We build airplanes that can fly across the world, and then we build radar to watch for the airplanes. We build ships that can cross the ocean, and then we build sonar to listen for the ships. We are in a perpetual frantic race to catch up with our own cleverness, like a dog chasing its own tail in a thunderstorm. By the end of the year, the chain of towers began to sprout like weeds all along the English coast. They stood against the horizon, silent and watchful, a row of iron sentinels that never blinked, never slept, and never got tired of staring into the distance. It was the year that the sky became a glass house, and although the people of the world walked about their business, ignorant of the invisible beams that were crisscrossing the heavens above their heads, the era of the secret maneuver had passed. From that day forward, every machine that climbed into the blue was etched upon the records of the watchers, and history, once again, found itself unable to hide from the persistent flickering light of human curiosity. Chapter 7. The Fellowship of the Empty Glass. It is a singular quirk of the human constitution that while we are perfectly capable of inventing a machine to track an enemy airplane across the stratosphere, we remain entirely helpless when it comes to managing the contents of our own pockets, or more specifically, the contents of the bottles we keep in our cupboards. For centuries, the American male has held a deep, sentimental, and occasionally ruinous affection for the distilled spirits of the grain and the grape. He has treated the bottle as a confidant, a solace for the weary, and a necessary lubricant for the gears of commerce. Yet, every generation or so, the moral guardians of the nation rise up in a state of holy agitation, declare that the demon rum is the sole architect of all human misery, and attempt to outlaw the entire business with a flourish of legislation. By 1935, the country had recently emerged from the great experiment of prohibition, a 13-year crusade that had succeeded in doing exactly two things. It had made the manufacture of illegal bathtub gin a national industry, and it had turned the average American citizen into a lawbreaker of the most creative and enthusiastic variety. When the law was finally repealed, the populace heaved a collective sigh of relief and headed for the taverns, only to find that the years of dry drought had left many a man with a thirst that could not be slaked by a simple pint. In the industrial city of Akron, Ohio, a place more famous for the manufacture of rubber tires than for the salvation of souls, two gentlemen found themselves in a condition of mutual, profound, and highly unrefined despair. One was a stockbroker who had lost his fortune in the crash and his composure in the bottom of a bottle. The other was a surgeon whose hand had become so unsteady from the morning's libations that he could no longer hold a scalpel without causing his patients to tremble with apprehension. These two men, meeting in a hotel lobby, fell to talking, not about the weather, nor the state of the markets, nor the lamentable decay of the nation's morals, but about the only subject that truly occupied their minds, the terrible, gripping, relentless necessity of the next drink. They spoke for hours, and in the process, they stumbled upon a notion so radical, so profoundly simple, and so contrary to the prevailing wisdom of the medical and clerical professions that it had the force of a revelation. They decided that the best way to cure a man of his fondness for the bottle was not an act of Congress, nor a lecture from a stern-faced deacon, nor a stint in a sanitarium where he was fed nothing but oatmeal and cold water while being told that his character was a moral vacuum. No, they concluded that the only person capable of dragging a man out of the ditch is another fellow who has been down in the same mud, has felt the same chill in his bones, and has clawed his way out by the skin of his teeth. Thus was born the Fellowship of the Empty Glass. It was a radical departure from the American tradition of dealing with a vice. Hitherto, if a man was a drunkard, the community either ostracized him, prayed over him, or locked him in a cage. The fellowship, however, suggested that he be welcomed into a room, sat down in a folding chair, and told that he was not a sinner in the eyes of the Almighty, but merely a man suffering from an allergy to ethanol. It is a beautiful thing to witness the birth of a new idea in a world that is obsessed with old failures. The first meetings were held in the kitchens of private homes, where the coffee was strong, the air was thick with the smoke of cheap tobacco, and the stories were told with a brutal, unvarnished honesty that would have made a professional preacher turn pale. There were no tables of statistics, no formulas for sobriety, and no high-minded speeches about the destiny of the Republic. There was only the account, the story of the night the car went into the ditch, the morning the boss called to say he was fired, and the twilight of the soul where a man discovers that his only friend in the world is a corkscrew. The beauty of the arrangement lay in the fact that it required no authority other than the shared experience of the gutter. If a man walked into a room and claimed he had found the secret to sobriety through meditation, he was laughed at. If he claimed he had found it through a new diet, he was ignored. But if he stood up and said, "My name is Bill, and I once drank a bottle of turpentine because it looked like gin," he was greeted with the nodding heads of 50 men who knew exactly how that tasted. The doctors of the time, who liked to treat human misery with pills, powders, and solemn lectures, looked upon this gathering of laymen with deep suspicion. They wanted to know the scientific mechanism of the cure. Where were the tests? Where were the charts? Where was the institutional oversight? When the members of the fellowship told them that the cure was simply staying away from the first drink one day at a time, the doctors shook their heads and muttered about the lack of clinical rigor. But the fellowship did not care a fig for clinical rigor. They were too busy keeping each other from jumping off bridges and helping each other find employment in a world that had written them off as hopeless wrecks. They established a chain of communication that functioned better than the telephone company. If a member was out in the middle of the night, shivering with the shakes, and staring longingly at the neon sign of a tavern, he could make a call, and within 20 minutes, another member would show up at his door, not with a lecture, but with a cup of coffee and a story about how he had once spent 3 days in a jail cell in Chicago with nothing but a pair of shoes for company. It was a curious paradox of the era. Here was a world that was becoming increasingly mechanical, increasingly bureaucratic, and increasingly obsessed with the numbers on the ledger. Everything was being counted, measured, and filed away by the federal government. Yet, in the back rooms of these Ohio houses, a group of men were practicing a form of salvation that relied entirely upon the one thing the bureaucrats could not quantify: human empathy. They understood that the bottle is not merely a vessel for liquid. It is a mask that a man wears to hide from the uncomfortable reality of his own existence. By taking off the mask and showing their scarred faces to one another, they found they could walk through the world without needing to hide. They realized that they were not the only ones who found the world a frightening, overwhelming, and occasionally insufferable place to live, and that the best way to handle the noise was not to dull the senses, but to find a few comrades who would listen when you spoke the truth. One might have thought that such a movement would remain a local curiosity, a footnote in the history of Akron's industrial fatigue. But the fellowship had a secret weapon that no amount of government regulation could stifle: the truth. And the truth, once spoken, has a way of traveling. By the end of 1935, the word had begun to spread. Letters were written, meetings were organized in other cities, and the simple, quiet, non-denominational logic of the account began to seep into the consciousness of the nation. It was the most important discovery of the decade, far more significant than the invention of radar or the construction of the Boulder Dam. For while the dam could hold back a river and the radar could track an airplane, only the fellowship of the broken could hold back the tide of human despair. They had found that the way to fix a shattered life is not to replace the pieces with something new, but to glue them together with the shared recognition that every man at some point has been looking into the bottom of an empty glass and wondering where the rest of his life had gone. They went about their business with a quiet, persistent, and entirely unbureaucratic resolve. They asked for no grants, they lobbied for no laws, and they sought no glory. They were content to remain in the shadows, helping the next man in the ditch, one cup of coffee and one honest sentence at a time. It was a triumph of the spirit over the statistics, a reminder that in a world of grand projects and cold machinery, the most powerful force on earth is still the simple, unadorned, and desperately human act of one man telling another that he is not alone. Chapter 8: The Pacific Stroll of the Solo Aviatrix. The human race has always had a troublesome habit of thinking that oceans were designed by the Creator for the express purpose of keeping one continent away from the other. It is a comforting notion, a sort of built-in moat for the planet, which allows the inhabitants of one side to look across the water and imagine that the people on the other side are perhaps a bit more peculiar, or a bit more dangerous, or at the very least, not quite as sensible as the folks back home. For centuries, the Pacific Ocean, that vast, uncharitable, and mostly blue expanse of nothingness, served as the ultimate gatekeeper. It was the place where ships went to disappear, where sailors went to get scurvy, and where map-makers went to vent their artistic frustrations by drawing sea monsters in the margins. To cross it in a boat was a task that required months, a robust constitution, and a complete lack of interest in ever seeing one's relatives again. To cross it by air, in the year 1935, was considered by the learned men of the aeronautical establishment to be an undertaking that bordered on the suicidal. When a woman, a slim, unassuming creature by the name of Amelia Earhart, decided that She would like to take a casual afternoon flight from the sandy shores of Hawaii to the bustling coast of California. The world responded with a mixture of polite concern and professional scoffing. The aviation experts, a class of gentlemen who rarely flew themselves but were exceedingly fond of calculating the exact probability of failure for those who did, pointed to their slide rules in their charts and explained, with the tedious patience one offers a small child, that the thing was simply not feasible. They argued that the engine would freeze, that the fog would swallow the craft, that the radio would go silent, and that the Pacific itself would eventually grow bored and reach up to claim its toll. They were particularly bothered by the fact that she intended to do this alone. They seemed to feel that if one must throw one's life away, it should at least be done in the company of a navigator who could share the blame for the catastrophe. Miss Earhart, however, possessed a temperament that was entirely immune to the gravity of such forecasts. She viewed the Pacific not as a watery fortress, but as a long, straight road that happened to be made of salt water rather than gravel. She climbed into her Lockheed Vega, a bright red machine that looked like a shiny mechanical beetle, with the same air of practical detachment a housewife might show when stepping into a carriage for a trip to the market. She did not seek out the cameras for a dramatic farewell. She did not consult the omens. She simply checked her fuel, adjusted her goggles, and pointed the nose of the plane toward the rising sun. The flight itself, to hear her tell it later, was a remarkably monotonous affair, which is the highest compliment one can pay to a journey that should have, by all the laws of common sense, ended in a watery grave. She spent the better part of the day and night suspended between the stars and the swell, surrounded by an engine that droned with a rhythmic persistence that would have lulled a lesser spirit into a stupor. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the upper atmosphere, a silence so profound that it makes the sound of a human heartbeat seem like a drum in a cathedral, alone in the cockpit, with nothing to look at but the endless curve of the horizon and nothing to listen to but the mechanical vibration of her own progress. Earhart displayed a quality of mind that is rarely found in the annals of history, a complete and total indifference to the concept of sharks. Now, it is a well-known fact that the Pacific is teeming with creatures that are, to put it mildly, hostile to the notion of a female aviator falling into their dinner service. Yet, as she droned over the waves, she did not once look down and wonder if the creatures below were waiting for her to make a mistake. She had far more important things to consider, like the temperature of her oil, the state of her fuel gauges, and the persistent nagging question of whether the coastline of California would actually be where she expected it to be when the dawn finally broke. For 18 hours, she was the only human being in the entire world who knew exactly what the middle of the Pacific felt like. It was not a place of terror or grandeur. It was a place of business. It was a geography that required a steady hand, a sharp eye, and a heart that didn't know how to flutter when the odds grew long, while the rest of the world slept, drank their morning coffee, or worried about their local taxes. She was tracing a thin, invisible line across the globe, knitting the two halves of the world together with a single, reliable engine. When the coastline of California finally emerged from the morning haze, a jagged brown and entirely solid piece of reality, the reception she received was one of sheer, unadulterated bewilderment. The people at the airfield in Oakland had been watching the sky with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief, fully expecting to be informed by the Coast Guard that the red plane had been swallowed by the deep. When she dropped out of the clouds and touched her wheels to the runway, the crowd didn't know whether to cheer, offer her a stiff drink, or ask her if she'd remembered to bring back any souvenirs from the islands. She climbed out of the cockpit, stretched her legs, and remarked that the flight had been quite pleasant. This, of course, was the final insult to the men of science. They had calculated the wind resistance, the fuel consumption, and the psychological strain of the journey, and they had arrived at the mathematical conclusion that she should have been exhausted, traumatized, and perhaps a bit lost. To have her land with a smile and a comment about the pleasantness of the air was almost an act of treason against the solemnity of the endeavor. But Amelia had done something far more significant than setting a record. She had done away with the myth of the impassable sea. She had turned the Pacific Ocean into a commute. She had shown that the world was not a series of isolated islands, separated by insurmountable barriers, but a connected, shrinking, and entirely accessible neighborhood. She had stripped the ocean of its mystery and replaced it with a flight plan. The consequence of this, of course, was that the world suddenly felt a great deal smaller. The great brooding mystery of the West was gone, replaced by the mundane reality of a woman in a red plane who had simply decided to fly home for the weekend. People began to look at their maps differently. They began to realize that if a woman in a single-engine plane could span the Pacific without so much as a nervous tremor, then there was very little left in the world that was truly out of reach. It was a transformative moment, though it was packaged in such a modest and unassuming way that many people didn't quite grasp its significance until years later. They were too busy admiring the gumption of the lady to realize that she had fundamentally altered the way humanity looked at the planet. They saw a hero, but what they really had was a precursor to the modern age, a herald of the time when the furthest corners of the earth would be as easy to reach as the local post office, and when the terrifying silence of the middle of the ocean would be replaced by the constant buzzing hum of air traffic. So, the Pacific Stroll was concluded not with a flourish of trumpets or a grand declaration of conquest, but with the quiet landing of a red plane on a California strip. The ocean remained vast and indifferent as ever, but it had been touched by human audacity, and it would never again be the solitary gatekeeper it had been since the beginning of time. Miss Earhart went about her business, the engineers went back to their slide rules to figure out how they'd been so spectacularly wrong, and the world, now a little tighter, a little closer, and a little more crowded, settled into the realization that there were no more frontiers left that could not be crossed by anyone with a decent engine and a stubborn refusal to be afraid of the water. Chapter 9. The Paperback Rebellion. For centuries, the noble art of literature had been held in a state of comfortable captivity by the literary aristocracy. In the year of our Lord 1935, if a man wished to commune with the great minds of the age, or even the middling minds of the local mystery writers, he was expected to approach the book with the same degree of reverence one might accord a dead pope. Books were produced as if they were furniture. They were heavy leather-bound monstrosities with gold leaf lettering, destined to sit upon the mahogany shelves of a gentleman's library, gathering dust and serving as a mute testament to the owner's unread education. They were expensive, of course, costing as much as a sturdy pair of boots or a week's supply of groceries, and they were heavy enough to sink a small rowboat. To carry one in your pocket was an impossibility. To read one on a public omnibus was an act of extreme social defiance that would have seen you hauled off by the conductor for taking up too much space. Literature, in short, was a luxury for the idle rich, a sedentary pastime that required a fireplace, a velvet armchair, and an abundance of leisure time that the average working man in London or New York found as rare as an honest politician. But then came a fellow by the name of Allen Lane, an Englishman with a peculiar, rebellious, and highly unaristocratic notion. As the story goes, Mr. Lane had been visiting the famous novelist Agatha Christie and was returning to London by train. He found himself at the railway station, struck by a sudden and ferocious thirst for something to read, not a newspaper, which offered nothing but the morning's dose of scandal and catastrophe, but a real book, one that might transport him out of the grime and smoke of the station and into a world of imagination. He searched the kiosks and the bookstalls, expecting to find the literary equivalent of a snack, but all he found were lurid magazines, cheap sensationalist pamphlets, and those bloated, expensive hardcovers that were far too clumsy for a traveler. He realized, with the sudden clarity that often strikes a man when he is frustrated by the mediocrity of his fellow creatures, that there was a massive, untapped audience for good stories that didn't require a mortgage to purchase or a pack mule to transport. And so, he unleashed the Paperback Rebellion. He founded a company called Penguin Books, choosing the name because it sounded dignified but flippant, which is a combination the English usually reserve for their tea-time habits. And he began to publish high-quality literature in small, thin, paper-covered volumes that were sized to fit perfectly in a man's hip pocket or a lady's handbag. The literary establishment reacted to this with the horrified indignation of a duchess who has just discovered a commoner dipping his biscuit into her tea. They decried the move as the cheapening of culture. They claimed that by putting great works of fiction, works by the likes of Hemingway, Christie, and Sayers, into a package that cost exactly the same as a packet of cheap cheroots, Mr. Lane was dragging the muses into the gutter. They argued that a book should be a treasured possession, a thing of leather and spine, not a disposable trifle that one would discard in a park bench or leave behind on a bus. Mr. Lane, being a man of business and possessing a sharp, pragmatic mind, ignored the protests of the velvet-jacketed critics. He knew what they did not, that the common man is starved for a bit of wit and wisdom, and that he is quite capable of appreciating a fine turn of phrase, even if it isn't embossed in gold. He priced his books at sixpence, a price so modest that a laborer could buy one out of his loose change, and he began to flood the market with volumes that were as colorful and cheerful as a flock of birds. The public, having never been asked if they wanted to read good books at an affordable price, responded with an enthusiasm that bordered on a riot. Within months, the Penguin became a familiar sight in every corner of the British Empire. You would see a bus driver in London pausing for a moment between routes, pulled a slim orange and white volume from his coat pocket, and losing himself in a detective story while the rain pelted the windows. You would see a clerk in a bustling office, eating her sandwich with one hand and holding a classic novel with the other, effectively taking a vacation to a foreign country in the space of a 10-minute break. It was a revolution of the most profound sort. For the first time in history, the wisdom of the ages was no longer trapped behind the glass doors of a private library. It was out in the streets, in the pubs, on the park benches, and in the hands of the people who actually built the world. A man could carry the plays of Shakespeare or the prose of the modern masters in his hip pocket without tearing his trousers, and he could read them while waiting for a tram, while sitting in a dentist's chair, or while hiding from his mother-in-law in the garden. The critics, those grumpy gatekeepers of the printed word, continued to moan that the portability of the books led to their misuse. They pointed to the fact that people were reading on the move, reading in public, and, heaven forbid, reading in the bath. They felt that a book should be an ordeal, something you sat down to face with a solemnity of spirit, not a casual companion to be dipped into at will. They could not understand that, for the common reader, the book was not a cathedral to be worshipped, but a companion to be enjoyed. By the end of 1935, the Penguin had colonized the nation. The books were appearing in drugstores and kiosks and in shops that had never before dared to stock anything more sophisticated than a box of chocolates. The rebellion had succeeded, and the literary snobs were left to stand in their dusty libraries, clutching their leather-bound tombstones and complaining that the world had gone to the dogs, or, more accurately, to the birds. It is a grand irony that the most lasting change in the culture of the 1930s was not the signing of a treaty, the building of a dam, or the invention of a new weapon, but the simple, humble act of making the book accessible. Mr. Lane had proven that if you treat the public with a little bit of intelligence and a fair amount of honesty, they will surprise you with their desire to learn, to grow, and to escape into the realms of the mind. One cannot help but admire the sheer democratic spirit of those little books. They didn't care if you were a duke or a docker. They contained the same words, the same genius, and the same joy. They were the great levelers, the paper messengers that broke down the walls of the library and let the light of literature flood into the dark corners of the working day. As we look back at the ledger of 1935, a year characterized by its concrete-heavy projects and its anxiety-ridden politics, it is refreshing to find this one bright, fluttering, and altogether marvelous development. It is a reminder that while the government may build a wall to hold back a river or a bureau, to hold back the tide of poverty, the true measure of a society is how easily it allows its people to carry a library in their pockets. The Paperback Rebellion proved that the thirst for stories is as natural as the thirst for water, and that when you provide the means for that thirst to be quenched, the world becomes a place that is a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more curious, and a whole lot less burdened by the gravity of its own stuffiness. And if a few books were ruined by rain, or stained by coffee, or dog-eared by the passage of 1,000 hands, well, that is a small price to pay for the knowledge that a good story is finally, after all these centuries, free to roam the world at the speed of a man walking to work. Chapter 10. The Illumination of the Midnight Pastime. In the natural order of the world, a system established long before the invention of the electric bulb, the stock ticker, or the unfortunate desire of the human race to turn every waking moment into a potential revenue stream, there was an agreement between the sun and the game of baseball. It was a covenant as old as the hills and as sensible as a pair of sturdy work boots. When the sun went down, the game ceased, and the players went home to their suppers, their families, and their proper ordained sleep. It was a rhythm dictated by the turning of the earth and the exhaustion of the human frame. A man played in the golden warmth of the afternoon. He finished his business by the time the shadows grew long and the crickets began their twilight concert, and he retired in the knowledge that he had done a day's work and enjoyed a day's recreation. But by the middle of the 1930s, the American business mind, a creature of restless, unrelenting, and frequently misguided ingenuity, had decided that this natural arrangement was a gross inefficiency. They looked upon the empty seats of the ballpark during the evening hours and saw not a time for rest, but a vacuum of lost profit. They reasoned that if a man could be enticed to work in a factory until the whistle blew at 5 o'clock, he could surely be enticed to sit in a grandstand for another 3 hours, provided that the ground was flooded with enough artificial light to make the night feel like a continuation of the day. Thus it came to pass on the 24th day of May that the city of Cincinnati, under the guidance of one Mr. Powell Crossley, Jr., a man who clearly possessed a great deal of surplus electricity and a profound skepticism regarding the natural bedtime of the citizenry, decided to host a Major League Baseball game at an hour when any self-respecting owl would consider it dawn. The scene at Crossley Field was one of such unnatural brilliance that it was enough to make a man blink his eyes and wonder if he had accidentally walked into a celestial experiment. 8 enormous steel towers, each bristling with a forest of glass bulbs that hummed with the sound of a trapped hive of bees, stood sentry around the diamond. When the switch was thrown, the field was instantly bathed in a glare so fierce and stark that the grass seemed to take on a shade of green that had never existed in nature, a color that might be described as electric billiard table velvet. The players, poor fellows, emerged from their dugouts into this manufactured day with the squinting, confused expressions of moles who had been dragged out of their burrows by a particularly aggressive child. They were used to the dappled shadows of the afternoon, where the flight of a baseball could be tracked by the grace of the sun. Here, under the harsh, unblinking eye of the towers, every movement became a sharp staccato event. The shadows were not soft, as God intended them to be, but hard, black, and insistent, stretching out behind the fielders like the ghosts of their own incompetence. The spectators, meanwhile, sat in the stands in a state of high nervous agitation. They felt that they were participating in a violation of some ancient unspoken law. The air was cool, for it was, after all, night, but the light was hot, or at least it felt hot, a sensation of dry, baked sterility that made one feel as though they were living inside a giant lantern. They watched the Reds and the Phillies go about their business, chasing a leather ball through the evening dew, and they could not help but feel that commerce had finally achieved its ultimate triumph. It had successfully kidnapped the night and forced it to go to work. There is a particular melancholy in seeing a game played by the light of a bulb when the stars are trying their best to twinkle overhead. It is a reminder that we are a species that cannot bear to let anything go, not even the darkness. We must conquer every inch of our environment. We must turn every shadow into a storefront. And we must ensure that no hour of the 24 is left unburdened by the necessity of being productive. As the game proceeded, a tight, low-scoring affair that the Reds eventually won, Though the final score was of less importance than the spectacle itself, one could not help but reflect on the peculiar arrogance of the enterprise. We have built towers to pierce the clouds. We have paved the earth until it cannot breathe. And now we have decided that the sun is an unreliable employee that requires a backup team of electric lamps. We treat the natural world as if it were a draft document, waiting for the human race to come along and edit out all the boring parts like rest, twilight, and silence. The players themselves seem to find the situation a bit absurd. They moved with a hurried, unnatural energy as if they were worried that if they paused for too long, the electricity might fail and leave them standing in the dark, exposed to the terrifying reality of the midnight hour. A pop fly that would have been a lazy, beautiful arc in the sunshine now became a frantic, desperate scramble to find the white sphere against the black velvet curtain of the sky. It was a game of baseball, to be sure, but it was a game of baseball played with the desperation of a man who knows he is cheating time. And what of the fans? They sat there, bathed in the artificial glow, consuming their peanuts and their sodas, and they cheered when the home team scored. But it was a cheer that lacked the languid, lazy contentment of an afternoon game. It was a cheer of synthetic excitement, the sort of fervor that is drummed up by the sheer volume of the lights and the manufactured urgency of the situation. They were having a fine time, no doubt. They were being entertained, but they were also being conditioned to accept that the day was no longer a finite thing. The day had been stretched, folded, and squeezed into the night, like a piece of dough being kneaded by a baker who has no intention of letting the bread rise. By the time the game concluded and the fans poured out of the stadium and into the quiet streets of Cincinnati, they were greeted by the jarring reality of the actual night. The city was dark, the moon was in its place, and the natural order had returned with a vengeance. But the people walked home with the lingering, buzzy sensation of the stadium light still burned into their retinas. They had seen the future, and the future was a place where no one ever had to go to sleep because the market would never permit it. One can see the trajectory of the century in that single, glowing field. It was the beginning of the end of the natural bedtime of a Christian gentleman. It was the triumph of the switch over the setting sun. From that day forward, the line between the productive day and the restful night would grow thinner and thinner until eventually the entire world would become a giant, illuminated, stadium-like structure where the hum of the electricity never ceases, the lights never dim, and the game, the relentless, unending game of commerce, goes on forever, regardless of the position of the stars. It is a grand accomplishment, to be sure. We have defied the darkness. We have outlawed the shadow. And we have proven that we can play ball at midnight if we have the gumption to wire the heavens. But sometimes, when the towers are humming and the glare is at its height, and one catches a glimpse of the moon hidden behind the steel struts, one cannot help but wonder, have we gained a few hours of fun, or have we merely made the night feel like a place where we are no longer welcome to be alone with our own thoughts? The Reds won, the crowds cheered, and the world marched on, a little brighter, a little louder, and a little more confused about the difference between the light of the sun and the light of the billable hour. And so the midnight pastime was born, and the natural world, ever patient and ever silent, waited for us to realize that while we can turn on the lights, we cannot, despite all our inventions, ever truly manage to turn off the dark. Chapter 11. The Imperial Anachronism in East Africa. There is a particular kind of madness that overtakes a man when he begins to believe that he is the reincarnation of a ghost. In the autumn of 1935, that madness had settled squarely upon the shoulders of Signor Benito Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy, a man who possessed a jawline of such aggressive prominence that it seemed to be constantly engaged in a silent argument with the rest of his face. Signor Mussolini had spent the better part of a decade trying to convince the Italian people, and more importantly himself, that he was the rightful heir to the Roman Empire, a claim that was roughly as sensible as a man in a modern waistcoat trying to assert ownership of the Colosseum because he happened to share a barber with Julius Caesar. He marched about the stage of Europe, chin thrust out, arms folded, and eyes narrowed into that look of practiced menace that is so popular among dictators, who are afraid that if they stop scowling for even a moment, the world will realize they are only human after all. He felt that Italy, which had spent the last century mainly concerned with the production of fine wine and the occasional opera, was being cheated out of its historical birthright. The great powers, the British, the French, the Germans, had all carved up the map of Africa like a Sunday roast, and Signor Mussolini felt that Italy had been left with nothing but the gristle. And so he cast his gaze toward Abyssinia, a rugged, mountainous, and thoroughly ancient kingdom in East Africa that had had the audacity to remain independent while its neighbors were being neatly packaged into the portfolios of European colonial ministries. To the rest of the world, Abyssinia was a sovereign nation with a history that reached back to the time of Solomon. To Mussolini, it was merely an inconvenient gap in his collection of stamps. He launched his invasion with all the theatrical grandeur of a grand opera. There were speeches from balconies, flags fluttering in the breeze, and enough bluster to power a steamship from Naples to the Red Sea. He sent his legions, modern, steel-clad, and smelling of diesel, to march backward into the 19th century. He ordered his generals to conquer an empire, confident that the world would be so impressed by the sheer spectacle of his ambition that they would forget to ask whether the business was moral, necessary, or even particularly profitable. It was an anachronism of the most staggering variety. Here was a man in the 20th century, surrounded by radio, aviation, and the impending shadow of the internal combustion engine, attempting to recreate the conquests of the Caesars. He sent tanks into the mountains where they promptly got stuck in the mud. He sent airplanes to drop mustard gas on villages that had never seen a motor car, proving that if you provide a man with enough technology, he can inflict a very modern kind of misery on people who were perfectly content to live in the age of the spear. The world looked on with the sort of nervous, shifting-footed embarrassment one feels when a guest at a dinner party suddenly decides to stand on the table and recite poetry. The League of Nations, that grand and toothless institution that had been established in the wake of the Great War to ensure that such things would never happen again, went into a state of intense, agonizing, and entirely useless agitation. The League of Nations was a collection of gentlemen who were excellent at holding meetings about the necessity of having more meetings. They gathered in Geneva, in a building that smelled of floor wax and high-minded intentions, and they debated the crisis with a gravity that would have been appropriate for the impending collapse of the sun. They debated whether the invasion was a breach of the peace, a violation of the covenant, or merely an unfortunate misunderstanding that required further study. They ultimately decided to issue an editorial of standard grade sternness. They threatened sanctions, a polite word for a request that everybody else stop trading with Italy. But they did so with so many exceptions, so many loopholes, and so many meaningful glances toward their own wallets, that the sanctions were about as effective as trying to stop a flood with a paper napkin. They banned the sale of certain goods, but they were careful to exclude oil, coal, and steel, the very things an army needs to go about its work of conquest. It was the ultimate demonstration of international hypocrisy. They wanted to be seen as protectors of the peace, but they were quite unwilling to pay the price of being peacekeepers. Signor Mussolini watched this display of impotence with the satisfied smirk of a schoolboy who has just realized the teacher is too timid to hand out a detention. He knew that the League was a paper tiger, and he treated their resolutions with the same respect one accords a leaflet on the sidewalk. He kept his tanks rolling, his planes flying, and his legions marching, indifferent to the fact that he was tearing the entire post-war order to pieces. The tragedy of the affair, however, was not just the conquest of Abyssinia, but the exposure of the rot at the heart of the civilized world. Everyone knew that what Mussolini was doing was wrong. Everyone knew that the League was failing, and everyone knew that if the strong were allowed to swallow the weak simply because they had a louder voice and a faster tank, then the entire peace of the world was built on sand. But the nations of Europe were busy looking at their own balance sheets, their own internal squabbles, and their own fears of the new bogeymen rising in the north. They chose to let Abyssinia burn rather than risk a fire in their own fireplaces. It was a grim instructional tale. It demonstrated that when a state wishes to behave like a beast, it will do so. And if the neighbors are too polite, too timid, or too busy to intervene, the beast will eventually come to assume that it has a license to behave as it pleases. Mussolini walked through the streets of Rome, his chest puffed out like a pigeon, convinced that he had resurrected the Roman Empire, while in truth he had only resurrected the Roman vice of believing that power is the only language worth speaking. As for the Abyssinians, they fought with a courage that was as desperate as it was futile. They faced the tanks with rifles that had been manufactured in the previous century, and they faced the gas with nothing but the scarves they wrapped around their faces. They were a people who believed that the world would stand by its word, that the League would protect the innocent, and that justice had a place in the councils of men. They learned, in the bitterest possible fashion, that in the year 1935, justice was a luxury that only the powerful could afford, and that the only law that truly held sway in the international arena was the law of the strongest arm and the longest cannon. The invasion dragged on a slow, ugly, and grinding affair that stained the reputation of Europe and signaled to every other dictator with a dream of conquest that the international community was nothing more than a phrase to be used in speeches. It was a bleak, dusty, and altogether shameful chapter of human history, one where the great ideals of the post-war era were quietly buried in the sands of the Danakil Desert. One might have hoped that the world, having seen what happens when the bullies are left to run the playground, would have stood up and said, "No." But the world was tired, and it was distracted, and it was entirely convinced that if it just kept its eyes turned toward the floor, the trouble would pass them by. They were wrong, of course. The trouble never passes. It only gathers strength, feeding on the silence of the bystanders until it is strong enough to swallow the whole house. So, Signor Mussolini continued his charade, dressing his soldiers in uniforms that looked like they belonged in a museum and fighting a war that felt like it belonged in the Dark Ages. He had his empire, or at least he had the map of one, and for a few fleeting self-deluded moments, he felt as if he were truly the Caesar he had invented in his own head. But the history books, which have a way of being far less impressed by theatrical posturing than the newspapers, were already busy writing the final entry for his particular act of the play. They knew that when a man decides to build his monument on the ruins of someone else's home, he is not creating a legacy. He is merely digging a hole that he will eventually have to fall into himself. And as the year rolled toward its close, the shadow of the tanks in Abyssinia stretched out, growing longer and colder until it touched every capital in Europe, reminding them, if they were willing to look, that the peace they had been enjoying was not a solid, permanent thing, but a fragile, brittle, and rapidly expiring commodity. The world was sharpening its teeth, and the feast of the 20th century was only just beginning. Chapter 12. The Ink of Prejudiced Bureaucracy. It is a curious and lamentable feature of the human species that we possess an almost religious devotion to the act of classification. Give a man a ledger, a fountain pen, and a desk in a government office, and he will not be content until he has sorted the entire world into little boxes, labeled them with great precision, and convinced himself that by doing so he has mastered the universe. We classify the beetles, we classify the stars, and we classify the varieties of corn, which is a harmless and generally dull occupation. But there comes a time in the history of certain nations when the urge to classify takes a turn for the malicious, and the government decides that the most useful thing it can do with its ink is to define who is a human being and who is merely a statistical inconvenience. By the autumn of 1935, the authorities in Germany had decided that their country was suffering from a profound lack of order. They looked around at their citizens, people who had lived side by side for generations, people whose bloodlines were as tangled and interwoven as the roots of an old oak tree, and they decided that the messiness of humanity was an affront to the state. They were not satisfied with the crude, loud-mouthed thuggery of the street brawler. They wanted something more permanent, something more civilized, something that carried the weight of a seal and the authority of a judge. And so they codified their madness into the Nuremberg Laws. It was an astonishing piece of pen-pushing. They didn't just want to persecute, they wanted to make the persecution a matter of routine, a bureaucratic function that could be performed by any clerk with a rubber stamp and a sufficiently narrow view of the world. They sat down with their ink pots and their rule books and began to draw lines through the population, deciding with the cold, unfeeling logic of a tax assessor exactly who was in and who was out. The absurdity of the business would have been comedic if the consequences were not so dreadfully final. They spent days debating the percentage of ancestry required to constitute a citizen, as if they were discussing the purity of a gold ingot or the pedigree of a prize-winning pig. They argued over grandfathers, they argued over great-grandmothers, and they argued over the definitions of things that, in a sane world, would be considered entirely private and utterly irrelevant. They created a definition of race that was less a matter of biology and more a matter of administrative convenience, ensuring that the government's reach extended into the very blood of the people. One cannot help but marvel at the supreme arrogance of it all. Here were men who believed that they could, with a few strokes of a pen, override the messy, wonderful, and chaotic reality of human history. They believed that they could edit the people of a nation as one might edit a poorly written play, cutting out the lines and the characters that did not fit the director's vision of a masterwork. They treated the entire nation as if it were a filing cabinet, and they were the librarians, authorized to discard any file that did not meet their arbitrary standards of tidiness. The process of implementing these laws was a triumph of the mundane over the moral. It was not a grand, dramatic revolution, but a series of petty, nagging, and relentless inconveniences. It was the refusal to issue a marriage license. It was the removal of a man's name from the registry of his profession. It was the instruction to wear a mark or to carry a different set of papers. It was the transformation of neighbors into suspects and citizens into subjects through the sheer, grinding power of administrative paperwork. The genius of the evil, and it was a very specific, technical sort of genius, lay in the fact that it required the participation of the entire machinery of the state. It required the postman to stop delivering the mail to certain houses, it required the school teacher to count the children differently, and it required the shopkeeper to check the papers before he sold a loaf of bread. It turned the citizenry into a vast, unthinking, and mostly obedient bureaucracy, each person doing their small prescribed part to ensure that the order of the state was maintained. There is a particular horror in seeing a government use the tools of civilization, laws, records, census data, and orderly procedures, to dismantle the very idea of civilized life. We tend to think of tyranny as a wild, chaotic thing, a matter of shouting in the streets and swinging clubs. But the tyranny of 1935 was a quiet, polite, and terribly efficient thing. It was a tyranny that wore a tie, carried a briefcase, and always remembered to file its reports in triplicate. It demonstrated that when a state wishes to persecute its neighbors, it prefers to do so with a fountain pen and a neatly numbered list of subclauses, because it provides the state with the comfortable, self-deluding fiction that it is simply following the law. The people who wrote these laws, the men with the glasses and the stiff collars, likely went home to their wives and children after a long day of legislating. They likely worried about the price of coal, the quality of their tea, and the grades of their children in school. They were, in every outward sense, normal, sensible, and unremarkable men. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of the whole business. They were not monsters out of a fairy tale. They were clerks. They were functionaries. They were the men who believed that the highest calling of a human being was to serve the state, and if the state requested that they sort the population into pure and impure piles, then they would do so with a meticulous, prideful attention to detail. They had convinced themselves that they were doing something historical, something necessary for the future of the race. They cloaked their prejudice in the language of science and the gravity of the law, creating a framework of oppression that felt, to the casual observer, as stable and permanent as the mountains. They had taken the messy, unpredictable business of human life and tried to iron it flat, removing all the wrinkles of complexity and all the stains of diversity, leaving behind a blank, uniform sheet of paper that represented their ideal of a nation. But the history of the world is not written on a blank sheet. It is written in the blood, the bone, and the memory of the people. And no matter how many laws a clerk may write, and no matter how many stamps he may place upon a document, he cannot erase the truth of what he is doing. He can call it protection, he can call it preservation, and he can call it the law. But he cannot stop the fact that he is busy dismantling the foundations of his own soul. As the years passed, the ink of prejudiced bureaucracy would stain the entire continent. It would create a reality where a man's identity was determined not by his character, his deeds, or his love for his neighbor, but by the contents of a government file folder. It would create a world where the most dangerous thing a person could be was not classified, and where the most powerful person in the room was not the soldier with the sword, but the clerk with the registry. It serves as a grim and eternal warning to any people in any age who think that they can surrender their conscience to the state for the sake of order. For when you give the state the power to classify, to sort, and to define, you are giving them the power to exclude, to dehumanize, and eventually to destroy. The laws of the Nuremberg variety are not just a historical curiosity of a dark time. They are a blueprint for the kind of society that results when we allow the paperwork to take precedence over the person. The clerks of 1935 were so proud of their lists. They were so confident in their categories. They thought they had solved the problem of the messy nation. But history, in its own time and in its own way, would eventually hold those lists up to the light and reveal them for what they were. Not the work of statesmen, but the scratchings of small, scared men who believed that if they could just put a label on their fear, it would somehow make it go away. It is a lesson that is written in the margins of every book about that terrible time, if only we have the courage to read it. Be wary of the men with the pens, for they are the ones who prepare the ground for the fire. Chapter 13. The Great Schism of the Hard Hat. In the year 1935, the American labor movement was a bit like a grand old sailing ship that had found itself suddenly becalmed in the middle of a hurricane, with the captain insisting that the proper way to navigate was to consult the stars and polish the brass, while the rest of the crew was busy being pelted by the gale. The American Federation of Labor, the venerable, stiff-collared, and utterly respectable governing body of the working man, had been, for half a century, the high cathedral of the craft union. They were a gentlemanly sort of club, you see, where a fellow who knew how to carve a dovetail joint or lay a brick with artistic precision was treated as a member of the aristocracy of industry. They organized men by what they did with their hands, and they believed that if you were a carpenter, you had absolutely nothing of interest to discuss with the fellow who happened to be operating the drill press in the same room. It was a system that worked well enough when the world was a workshop, but by the 30s, the world had been transformed into a factory. The era of the individual craftsman, shaping his wood and his iron with the patient affection of a father for a child, was being steamrolled by the machine age. The factory did not care if you were a carpenter or a bricklayer. It only cared that you were a warm body, capable of standing in front of a conveyor belt for 10 hours a day, performing the same repetitive motion until your soul felt as numb as your thumbs. The unwashed, unrepresented masses of the assembly line were left to fend for themselves. ignored by the high and mighty craft unions who thought these factory boys were not skilled enough to bother with. Into this atmosphere of polite bureaucratic stagnation walked John L. Lewis. Now, to look at Mr. Lewis was to understand the very definition of a force of nature. He had eyebrows that looked like two migrating caterpillars, a voice that sounded like a gravel truck dumping its load, and a temperament that suggested he had been born with a chip on his shoulder and had spent every waking moment since trying to find someone large enough to knock it off. He was the head of the United Mine Workers, a union of men who spent their days digging in the dark and their evenings wondering if the company store was planning to take their final penny before the week was out. Lewis was a man who did not believe in the slow, agonizing, circular palaver of the committee room. He believed that if you wanted to build a fire, you didn't hold a seminar on the properties of heat. You lit a match. He looked at the vast, sprawling, and entirely ignored industrial workforce of the nation, the men who built the cars, the steel, and the rubber, and he saw an army that was currently waiting for a general. He proposed that the labor movement stop worrying about whether a man used a hammer or a wrench and start worrying about the fact that the company was stealing the bread from his children's plates. He advocated for industrial unionism, organizing men by the factory, by the industry, by the collective wall they stood against. The old guard of the AFL, however, treated this suggestion as if it were a polite request to burn the clubhouse down. They were quite comfortable with their traditions, their protocols, and their carefully tiered social hierarchy. They didn't want a mass movement. They wanted a nice, manageable organization that didn't rock the boat. The collision of these two philosophies, the old craft mentality versus the new industrial ambition, came to a head at the AFL convention in Atlantic City in the autumn of 1935. It was a gathering of men in suits arguing about bylaws and credentials with the intensity of medieval theologians debating the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin. Lewis, growing more impatient by the minute, began to argue his case with a volume that rattled the windows. The opposing side was led by a fellow named Bill Hutchison, a man who possessed all the flexibility of a tombstone and the warmth of a glacier. As the debate raged, the two men found themselves in a verbal tangle that was about as dignified as a street brawl in a boarding house. Hutchison, perhaps mistaking the convention floor for a boxing ring, or perhaps simply having run out of vocabulary, decided that the best argument he could make was a physical one. There was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that precedes a thunderclap. And then, with the sudden, beautiful efficiency of a falling chandelier, John L. Lewis stepped forward and punched the gentleman squarely in the jaw. It was a right cross that would have made a professional pugilist nod in appreciative approval. Mr. Hutchison went down. The room went up in a cacophony of shouts, and the Great Schism was officially signed, sealed, and delivered in the medium of a bruised chin. It was a ridiculous, barbaric, and utterly necessary moment. It was the physical embodiment of the divide between the past and the future. The next day, Lewis and his allies walked out of the convention, leaving the old men to their dusty ledgers and their dwindling relevance. They founded the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO, and they did so with the conviction of a crew that has just realized the old captain is incapable of steering the ship and has decided to take over the bridge. The birth of the CIO was the most important thing to happen to the American worker since the invention of the lunch pail. They did not sit around waiting for the employers to be nice. They went out into the factories, the steel mills, and the rubber plants. They spoke the language of the man on the floor. They told him that he was not just a cog in a machine, but a member of a collective, a force that could make the masters of the universe sit up and pay attention. They organized with the zeal of a new religion. They marched, they rallied, and when the companies proved stubborn, they sat down. The sit-down strike, that simple, ingenious, and entirely passive act of defiance, became their signature weapon. A man did not need to pick up a gun or a stone. He simply needed to stop moving. He sat at his station, folded his arms, and waited. And when the entire factory sat down with him, the silence was more terrifying to the management than 1,000 riots. It was the silence of a machine that refuses to run without its master. And for the first time, the masters realized that they were not the ones who held the keys to the kingdom. The CIO was a raucous, messy, and entirely American creation. It was full of hotheads, radicals, and people who had never been invited to an AFL committee meeting in their lives. It was not polite. It was not genteel. And it was certainly not organized according to the rules of the craft. It was, in short, the perfect match for the industrial age. It was a union that was as large, as loud, and as complicated as the factories it sought to represent. By the end of the year, the landscape of the American workplace had been permanently altered. The old craft unions looked on with a mixture of horror and envy as the CIO swept across the industrial heartland like a wildfire. They had proven that the strength of the worker does not lie in his skill with a particular tool, but in his solidarity with the man standing next to him. They had broken the mold of the 19th century labor organization and replaced it with a model that could actually stand up to the might of the modern corporation. John L. Lewis became the hero of the hour, the man who wasn't afraid to use his fists to make a point. And while the historians might look back and wince at the lack of decorum, the workers of 1935 knew the truth. Sometimes, when the old guard is too stubborn to listen, a good, clean punch to the jaw is the most eloquent argument you can make. It was the year of the hard hat, the year of the industrial rally, and the year that the American worker decided he was done asking for permission to be treated like a human being. He was finished with the craft-based, polite, apologetic labor movement. He was ready for the roaring, stomping, sit-down-and-demand-it movement, and the world, whether it liked it or not, was going to have to make room for him. Chapter 14. The Final Verdict on the Nursery Theft. There is a particular brand of American tragedy that, when seasoned with a generous helping of celebrity, a dash of international mystery, and a heaping spoonful of newspaper sensationalism, transforms itself into something entirely different. It ceases to be a sorrow. It becomes a show. And in the year 1935, the good people of this republic were treated to the most morbidly magnificent performance of the decade, the trial of the century, held in the sleepy, unsuspecting town of Flemington, New Jersey. The matter at hand, as anyone who could read a headline already knew, was the theft of a child, the son of the famous aviator who had flown solo across the Atlantic and, in doing so, had become a sort of secular saint to a nation hungry for heroes. When that child was snatched from his nursery in the dead of night, the collective heart of the country skipped a beat, then began to pound with a frantic, agitated rhythm. It was a crime that, offended the very foundations of the American domestic ideal. The notion that a man's home is his castle and that his children are sacred, untouchable treasures. But the moment the investigation shifted from the nursery to the courtroom, the sanctity of the tragedy evaporated, replaced by the tawdry neon glare of the media circus. Flemington was invaded. Reporters, photographers, telegraph operators, and curiosity seekers descended upon the town like a plague of locusts in seersucker suits. The courthouse was turned into a stage, the lawyers were transformed into leading men, and the defendant, a stern, unblinking German carpenter named Bruno Hauptmann, was cast as the villain in a melodrama that no playwright would have dared to script for fear of being laughed out of the theater. The trial was a sight to elevate the spirit of any man who has a low opinion of his fellow creatures. It was a spectacle that made a Roman gladiatorial bout look like a quiet Sunday afternoon of croquet. People traveled for hundreds of miles just to stand outside the courthouse, peering through the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of a witness, a bailiff, or even a particularly sharp-looking necktie worn by a defense attorney. They brought their lunches, they brought their children, they brought a sense of festive anticipation that was entirely at odds with the gravity of the proceedings. Inside the room, the air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, perfume, and the unwashed fervor of a mob that had forgotten why it had gathered in the first place. The lawyers, those noble gladiators of the law, did not so much argue their cases as they did engage in a wrestling match of wits, gestures, and theatrical outbursts. Every motion was a performance. Every objection was a dramatic pause. Every cross-examination was a chance to play to the gallery. It was as if the life of a man and the memory of a dead child were merely props in a grand illusion. And what of the evidence? It was a collection of trifles that would have been laughed out of a small claims court in any other context. There were pieces of wood, ladders, floorboards, scraps of pine that were analyzed with the solemnity of a religious relic. There were ransom notes written in a German that sounded like a caricature of a cartoon villain. There were bags of money tracked across the city with the sort of detective work diligence one usually reserves for finding a lost pair of spectacles. The prosecution built a case that was, in its own way, a masterpiece of circumstantial scaffolding. They hammered together a story, nail by nail, until it stood up, even if it swayed a bit in the wind. Hauptmann, for his part, sat in the defendant's chair, with the expression of a man who had wandered into a bank robbery and was wondering when the teller would finish his business. He was a stony, silent, and entirely unsympathetic figure. He did not cry, he did not beg, and he did not confess. He simply looked at the judge, looked at the jury, and looked at the sea of hungry, hating faces in the gallery with a kind of profound Germanic indifference. Perhaps he was innocent, as he claimed to the very end. Perhaps he was the most cold-blooded monster to ever hold a chisel. But in the eyes of the public, it did not matter. He had been cast in the role of the boogeyman, and the audience was not about to accept a rewrite of the script. The judge, a man who possessed the patience of a saint and the stamina of a pack mule, presided over this chaos with a gavel that seemed to do little more than punctuate the noise. He attempted, in his own quiet way, to keep the circus from turning into a riot, but the spirit of the thing had escaped the bottle. The newspapers, those tireless engines of public opinion, had already decided the verdict weeks before the jury even set foot in the room. They ran editorials, they printed interviews, they conducted polls, and they fueled the fire of public rage until the very atmosphere in New Jersey seemed to vibrate with a demand for blood. When the final day arrived and the jury filed back into the room with their grim, paper-thin verdict, the tension was so sharp that a man could have cut his coat on it. The foreman stood up, his voice cracking like a dry twig, and spoke the words that the nation had been waiting to hear. Guilty. The response was not one of solemn judicial closure, it was an eruption. A cheer went up from the gallery, a raw, savage, and deeply human sound of satisfaction. People hugged each other, reporters sprinted for the telephones. The courtroom turned into a scene of chaotic, unbridled triumph. It was the verdict of a nation that wanted to put its nightmare to sleep, and it didn't care much whose head was resting on the pillow when the lights went out. As the years have passed, the echoes of that trial have grown faint, but the lesson remains as clear as a bell ringing in a graveyard. The Nuremberg trial was the moment when the American public discovered that it could consume tragedy just as easily as it could consume a Sunday comic. It was the day we learned that if you wrap a horror in the ribbons of a spectacle, you can make an entire country stand in line to watch it. The nursery theft was a crime, to be sure, but the trial was an indictment of us all. We turned a broken home into a public playground. We turned a private grief into a national commodity. And we proved that we are a people who, when faced with a mystery that scares us, will reach for the nearest scapegoat and demand a sacrifice, so long as the band plays loud enough to drown out the sound of the conscience. And so, the curtain fell on the trial of the century. The defendant went to his final appointment with the state. The aviator and his wife went back to their lives of haunted celebrity, and the rest of us went back to our daily business, feeling that justice had been done and that the world was, once again, in its proper place. But if you listen closely, in the quiet corners of history, you can still hear the clicking of the cameras, the scratch of the telegraphs, and the roar of the crowd in Flemington, reminding us that we once stood in the presence of a great sorrow, and instead of bowing our heads in silence, we pulled up a chair and asked for the best seat in the house. It is a grand, glorious, and utterly shameful thing to be a part of the human procession, isn't it? We build monuments to our heroes, and we build arenas for our tragedies, and we never seem to see the difference between the two until the show is over and the lights are dark. Chapter 15. The Silver Jubilee of the Quiet King. In the year of our Lord 1935, the British Empire was a great, creaking, and altogether magnificent contraption that had spent the better part of a century expanding its borders until the sun had finally given up trying to set on it. It was a time when the world still thought in terms of maps drawn in pink and red, and when the notion of a British monarch was not merely a political necessity, but a sort of geological feature of the landscape, as solid, as unmoving, and as occasionally tedious as a granite cliff. And so it came to pass that King George V, a gentleman who had spent 25 years on the throne with the grim determination of a man who has been asked to sit on a very uncomfortable stool for a quarter of a century, found himself celebrating his Silver Jubilee. It was a spectacle designed to remind the common folk that despite the fact that the world had recently gone to pieces and everyone was feeling a bit damp and discouraged, there was still a steady hand on the tiller of the state. The king himself was a curious study in regal restraint. He was not a man of grand gestures or flaming ambitions. He was a man who preferred the company of his stamp collection to the company of his ministers, and who found more genuine satisfaction in a well-aimed shot at a grouse on the Scottish moors than in the most stirring proclamation ever delivered in the House of Parliament. He was a man of the old school, wearing his uniforms with the stiff, slightly bewildered pride of a ship's captain who has been ordered to navigate a ship of state through a sea of changing manners and modern irritations. The Jubilee, however, was not about the man. It was about the institution. And the British people, being a nation that possesses a remarkable capacity for cheering when the sun comes out, turned the celebration into an affair of such immense and overwhelming bunting that it seemed the entire island might be hoisted into the air by the sheer volume of flags. The streets of London were packed to the rafters. There were parades that lasted until the horses were tired of prancing and the bands were tired of playing. There were tea parties in every village from Cornwall to the Hebrides. And there were speeches, God help us, enough to power a locomotive for a week. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool, fried fish, and the patriotic fervor of a people who were, at heart, just glad to have a reason to get out of the house and stand in the rain with their neighbors. It was a display of loyalty that would have been baffling to any other creature on the planet. A dock worker in Liverpool, who had spent the morning unloading crates of moldy onions and the afternoon wondering how he was going to pay the rent, would stand for 4 hours in the cold, waving a tiny paper flag as the king's carriage rattled by, and he would do it with a sincerity that was genuinely moving. He did not cheer for the politics. He cheered for the continuity. He cheered for the fact that in a world where everything was suddenly moving too fast, the king remained looking precisely as he had looked 20 years ago, and carrying on with the same steady, unimaginative, and entirely reliable pace. The king, for his part, sat in his carriage and looked at the sea of faces with an expression of polite, mild alarm. He was not a man who enjoyed the theater of it all. He would have been far happier in his study, with a magnifying glass in one hand and a rare perforated 19th century adhesive square in the other. He understood, however, that the crown is not a hat you wear for your own comfort. It is a weight you carry for the sake of the people who are busy cheering for you. He did his duty, he waved his hand, and he played the part of the grandfather of the nation with the stoic resignation of a man who knows that the best way to keep the peace is to show up and try not to trip over the carpet. But beneath the pageantry, beneath the waving flags and the ringing bells, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor in the foundation. The king, being a man of sharp, if narrow instincts, could feel it. He sat in the quiet of his palace at night, far from the roar of the crowds, and he harbored the suspicion that the show was nearing its finale. He looked at his son, the Prince of Wales, a fellow who was as dashing, as impulsive, and as deeply problematic as the old king was steady, and he could not help but wonder what would become of this grand, creaking ship once he was no longer at the wheel. The king was not a fool. He knew that the world was changing. He saw the rise of the new dictators on the continent. He heard the rumblings of discontent in the factories. He felt the cooling of the imperial ardor in the far-flung corners of his vast, pink-tinted map. He knew that the reign of the quiet king was a bridge, a pause in the violent, headlong rush of history, and that once that bridge was crossed, there would be no going back. It was a moment of profound historical irony. The people cheered for the king as a symbol of the good old days, the days of empire, the days of predictability, the days when a man knew his place and the king knew his. But the king himself knew that those days were already dead, buried in the mud of the Great War, and that he was merely the last actor on a stage that was being prepared for a completely different kind of performance. The Prince of Wales, meanwhile, moved through the shadows of the Jubilee with the restless energy of a man who finds the whole business a bit of a bore. He was the modern man, the man of the future, the man who wanted to be liked for himself, not for his title. He did not want to collect stamps. He wanted to live, to love, and to be a citizen of the world. It was a clash of two different eras, the era of duty and the era of desire. And the king, in his quiet, understated way, understood that the transition would be neither smooth nor simple. As the Jubilee drew to its close and the last of the fireworks faded from the London sky, the king retired to his rooms, no doubt with a sense of relief that the whole business of being a symbol was finally over for another day. He had done his part. He had held the line. He had maintained the dignity of the institution, even when he would have much preferred to be elsewhere. One cannot help but have a certain affection for George V. He was the most accidental of monarchs, a man who never expected the crown, and who wore it with the weary, patient grace of a man doing a job he didn't sign up for, but which he had determined to do well nonetheless. He was the anchor in the storm, the steady heartbeat of a nation that was terrified of the silence that would follow his departure. The crowds went home, the bunting was taken down, and the city returned to its gray, bustling, and troubled routine. The world outside the palace gates was still full of hunger, of anger, and of the rising tide of a new, darker century. But for a few days the people had held on to something, a feeling of belonging, a feeling of history, and a feeling that, for a little while, they were all part of the same story. The king would not last much longer. The shadows were lengthening. The energy of the reign was spent, and the change in management that he feared was waiting just around the corner, ready to sweep away the cobwebs of the Victorian age and usher in a time of chaos, passion, and uncertainty. But for now, the Silver Jubilee stood as a monument to the quiet man who had managed, through a combination of stubbornness and silence, to keep the old ship afloat for just a little while longer. It was a grand, hollow, and entirely necessary performance, and as the lights went out, one could almost hear history holding its breath, waiting to see what the next act would bring. Chapter 16. The Silent Mic of the Prairie Philosopher. It is a peculiar and somewhat disconcerting truth that the universe, for all its grand design and celestial clockwork, possesses a remarkably unrefined sense of humor. It likes to take the men we most rely upon to tell us the truth about ourselves, those rare, shiny, and altogether indispensable figures who stand at the front of the parade and point out that the emperor has forgotten his trousers, and it has a nasty habit of snatching them away just at the moment we have grown most accustomed to their presence. In the summer of 1935, that capricious old stage manager, Providence, decided that the American people had been enjoying a bit too much honesty for their own good, and it reached down into the Alaskan mud to reclaim one of the few men who had ever managed to tell the truth to the public for 20 years without getting himself chased out of town with a torch and a tar bucket? Will Rogers was a man who had built a career on the entirely improbable notion that a cowboy could walk into a parlor full of senators, oilmen, and high-hatted financiers, tie them into a knot with a bit of rope and a bit of wit, and have them thank him for the privilege. He was the Prairie Philosopher, a title that sounds terribly grand and intellectual, though Will himself would have likely preferred to be called a feller who knows a fool when he sees one. He had a mop of hair that looked as though it had been styled by a gale, a grin that suggested he knew exactly which horse you had bet on, and a voice that had the easy, rolling gait of a wagon on a gravel road. For 2 decades, Will had been the unofficial conscience of the American Republic. He stood before the microphones, he sat before the typewriters, and he wandered the halls of power, and he did it all with a gum-chewing casual indifference that drove the stuffy and the pompous to distraction. He was a master of the aw-shucks school of political evisceration. He could walk up to a man who was busy inflating his own reputation with the hot air of self-importance, and with a single, breezy sentence prick the balloon so effectively that it would never inflate again. And the best part of it, the truly miraculous, heart-lifting part of it, was that he never made them angry enough to shoot him. He was like the court jester who is allowed to tell the king he is a donkey, provided the jester does it while juggling 3 oranges and a hatchet. But in August of 1935, the world of aviation, that shiny motorized toy that the century was so proud of, decided to turn its attention to the north. Will, never one to sit still while there was a horizon to be investigated, had hitched his wagon to the Star of Wiley Post. Now, Wiley Post was a bird of a different feather entirely, a pilot who looked at the sky and saw not a place of philosophy, but a place of performance. He was a man who lived for the hum of the engine and the thrill of the altitude. Together, these 2 men, the philosopher and the daredevil, had set out to skip across the top of the world, heading into the vast, lonely, and unforgiving silence of Alaska. They traveled in a plane that was a hybrid contraption, a patchwork of ideas and parts, a flying laboratory of the new age. It was the sort of machine that the modern man looked at with awe, seeing in it the end of distances and the conquest of the globe. And for a while it worked. They hopped from one isolated outpost to another, greeted by the rugged inhabitants of the north as if they were visitors from another planet. They were the emissaries of the modern age, bringing with them the news, the gossip, and the sheer buzzing vitality of the lower 48. Then they descended into the mud. It was not a dramatic ending, not a battle in the clouds, not a heroic fall from the heavens. It was a landing gone wrong in the gray, damp, and indifferent Alaskan scrub. The engine sputtered, the plane tilted, and in the space of a heartbeat, the voice that had comforted, amused, and instructed millions of Americans was silenced. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a room after a sermon. It was the heavy, suffocating, and absolute silence of the wilderness. When the news reached the cities, the effect was unlike anything the country had experienced in a generation. It wasn't the mourning of a political leader or the grief for a soldier. It was the sudden, hollow feeling of a family that has lost its favorite uncle, the one who always brought the best stories and the one who always knew how to make the gloomiest day feel like a light breeze. The telegraphs clicked, the newspapers stopped their presses, and for a few days the entire frantic screaming and self-important business of the nation seemed to come to a grinding halt. People stood on the street corners and looked at each other with a new, strange sort of bewilderment. They asked, "Did you hear?" And the answer was always a simple, shaken head. It was as if a light had gone out in the middle of the room. Without Will Rogers, who was going to tell us that the government was just a collection of folks who were a little more confused than the rest of us. Who was going to tell the bankers that they were just playing with wooden nickels? Who was going to remind us that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account, but by the number of times he can make a friend laugh without expecting anything in return? We are a nation that is obsessed with great men. We build monuments to them. We write their biographies, and we name our schools and our highways after them. But Will Rogers was something better than a great man. He was a necessary man. He was the ballast in the ship of state. He kept the keel even when the winds of panic, greed, and political madness threatened to capsize the whole enterprise. He was the one who could stand in the middle of the storm and say, "Now, don't you worry. The sun is going to come up tomorrow, even if the politicians spend all night trying to pass a law to stop it." The tragedy of the crash was not merely the loss of a life. It was the loss of a mirror. In Will Rogers, the American people saw themselves, or at least they saw the version of themselves they liked best. The version that was skeptical of authority, appreciative of a good joke, and entirely confident that they could figure out any problem if they just sat down, rolled up their sleeves, and had a bit of common sense. Without that mirror, the public began to look a little less like themselves and a little more like the grim, humorless, and frightened creatures they were so terrified of becoming. The reaction of the country, the outpouring of letters, the weeping in the streets, the radio programs that played only the sound of his voice, was a testament to a truth that the great men of Washington never quite understood. They thought they were leading the people, and all the while, Will Rogers was the one who was actually holding them together. He was the invisible thread, the common language, the shared laugh that bridged the gap between the worker in the factory and the farmer in the field. As the weeks turned into months, the world moved on, as the world always does, with a cold and systematic indifference to the voids we leave behind. The radios found new voices, the newspapers found new scandals, and the machinery of the state continued to turn, grinding up the hours and the days with the same relentless efficiency. But for those who had listened to Will, who had relied on his daily column to tell them what was real in a world of political humbug, there was a permanent vacancy in the air. He was the last of a certain kind of American, the man who could be famous and yet stay common, the man who could be wealthy and yet stay humble, the man who could know the president and yet still feel more comfortable talking to the man who groomed his horses. We have plenty of celebrities now, heaven help us. We have plenty of people who are famous for being famous, and plenty of people who are rich because they've learned how to sell the sizzle instead of the steak. But we don't have many like Will. We don't have many who can look at a crowd of 10,000 people and make them feel as if he were sitting on the back porch, sharing a cup of coffee and a bit of news. So, the silent mic of the Prairie Philosopher was put away, and the world grew a little bit louder, a little bit more angry, and a little bit more certain of its own importance. We lost the man who could tell us that we were fools without making us want to tear his house down, and that is a loss that we are still trying to calculate. We are a poorer nation for his silence, and we are a more dangerous one, too. For without the voice that tells us to laugh at ourselves, we are left with only the voices that tell us to hate our neighbors. And that, my friends, is a comedy that never ends well. The mud of Alaska holds the remains of a pilot and a passenger, but the spirit of the thing, the bright, sharp, and entirely irrepressible spirit of Will Rogers, has vanished into the ether, leaving us to figure out the rest of the puzzle without our favorite guide. And if that doesn't make a man pause and consider the fragility of his own time, I don't know what will. Chapter 17. The Abrupt Conclusion of the Kingfish. The path of the populist is a road that winds through the pleasant meadows of I promise you everything, but it generally terminates at a precipice that nobody saw coming. In the great, humid, and swampy empire of Louisiana, there sat a man who had not only built this road, but had insisted on paving it with his own brand of frantic, golden-tongued, and entirely unsubtle genius. Huey Long, known to the common folk and the political cronies alike as the Kingfish, was a creature of such pure, undiluted audacity that he made the average politician look like a timid schoolboy who was afraid of the dark. He was a man who wore white suits that were as loud as a brass band, and he possessed a vocabulary that could charm the birds out of the trees or, should the situation require it, cuss a blue streak that would have singed the eyebrows off a mule. He had conquered Louisiana with the ferocity of a hurricane, establishing a domain where the laws were whatever he said they were, and the bank accounts of the state were merely an extension of his own personal petty cash box. He had a program called Share Our Wealth, a title that promised the poor the riches of the Titans, provided the Titans could be convinced to hand over their keys and their wallets with a smile. It was a grand, impossible, and utterly captivating dream. He told the people that every man was a king, but that no man should wear a crown, and then he proceeded to wear a crown so large it practically required a structural engineer to keep it balanced on his head. He built roads, he built bridges, and he built a political machine that functioned with the precision of a guillotine. He was the most successful demagogue that the American soil had ever produced, and he walked through the halls of power with the swagger of a man who believed that the Almighty had appointed him the sole arbiter of the public good. But the Kingfish, for all his roaring and his prancing, had forgotten the oldest rule of the American political swamp, that while you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, you can generally count on one individual lurking in the shadows with a grudge and a firearm to balance the scales of history when they get tipped too far in the wrong direction. The setting for the final act of this melodrama was the Louisiana State Capitol, a structure that the Kingfish himself had built, a phallic limestone skyscraper, rising out of the muggy bayou country like a monument to a man who had decided to challenge the skyline to a duel. It was a place of marble floors, echoing corridors, and a sense of absolute, suffocating authority. It was the Kingfish's castle, his fortress, and his laboratory. He walked those halls as if he owned the very air, and his retinue of bodyguards, with their nervous eyes and their holstered revolvers, trailed behind him like the satellites of a dying star. On that September evening, the Kingfish was in his element, holding court, barking orders, and basking in the glow of his own untouchability. The air was heavy, as it always is in Louisiana, and the atmosphere in the capital was thick with the scent of cigars, politics, and the nervous sweat of men who were waiting for the next decree. It was into this gilded cage of ambition that a young doctor, a man by the name of Carl Weiss, made his entry. History is a fussy old dame, and she often uses the most unlikely instruments to achieve her ends. Dr. Weiss was not a revolutionary, nor a political mastermind, nor a titan of industry. He was, by all accounts, a quiet man, a man of medicine, who had convinced himself that the kingfish was a blight upon the soul of the state. He approached the kingfish in the corridor, and with the sudden, terrible, and unthinking efficiency of a medical instrument, he produced a pistol and ended the reign of the kingfish with a single leaden gesture. The violence was brief, shocking, and entirely final. The bodyguards, those men who were paid to be the kingfish's shield against the world, erupted in a paroxysm of reflexive, blind, and overwhelming force. They turned their guns upon the doctor, and in a matter of seconds, the marble floor was stained with the ending of 2 lives. The tyrant and the assassin collapsed together in the debris of a broken political dream. The suddenness of it was enough to make a man's head spin. One moment, the kingfish was the center of the universe, the man who was going to redistribute the wealth of the nation, the man who was going to march his way into the White House and declare himself the new savior of the common man. The next moment, he was merely a mortal coil, cooling on the floor of his own magnificent building, and the roar of his influence began to fade into the hollow, echoing silence of the rotunda. There is a profound, almost whimsical cruelty in the way the world handles such things. The kingfish, who had spent his life convinced that he was the exception to every rule, discovered that he was subject to the same old, boring, and inevitable rules of biology and ballistics as the rest of us. He had built his power on the promise of security, yet he could not secure his own hallway from the anger of one man with a grudge. The aftermath was a scene of frantic, disorganized, and entirely useless scrambling. The political vultures, the loyalists, and the opportunists descended upon the corpse of the administration, trying to grab the reins of a machine that had been designed to be driven by only one pair of hands. The Share Our Wealth movement, which had claimed to have millions of followers, began to evaporate like mist in the morning sun, proving that a movement built on the personality of a single man is not a movement at all. It is a cult. And when the high priest dies, the congregation loses its map. It is a sobering lesson, though one that the politicians never seem to learn, no matter how many times it is repeated in the history books. They think that by shouting the loudest, by making the biggest promises, and by building the tallest monuments, they can somehow escape the gravity of reality. They think they are the masters of the storm, forgetting that the storm doesn't care who it blows down. They think they are the authors of the plot, forgetting that the plot is being written by the same old, indifferent hand that has been scribbling the same tired stories since the time of the Caesars. Huey Long was a man who wanted to be a legend, and in a way, he succeeded. He became the prototype for every populist who thinks that if he just talks fast enough and makes a big enough spectacle, he can bend the world to his will. He was the man who turned politics into a prize fight and the legislature into a circus. And he paid the price for his performance with the only currency that really matters. As we look back on that September night in Baton Rouge, we are struck by the sheer, unadulterated vanity of it all. We see the marble pillars, the frantic bodyguards, the desperate doctor, and the dying kingfish, and we see the truth of the human condition, that no matter how much noise we make, and no matter how much power we think we hold, we are all just guests in the house of history, and we don't get to decide when our visit is over. The kingfish had his day, and he used it to play God with the state of Louisiana. He shouted, he bullied, and he promised the moon, and for a while he made the people believe that the moon was well within their reach. But the earth kept spinning. The swamp kept creeping up to the steps of the Capitol, and the leaden end of his life served as a reminder that the path of the populist is frequently subject to sudden, leaden, and entirely unscheduled detours. It is a cautionary tale, to be sure, and one that is written in the blood of the State House, for anyone who cares to look closely at the marble floors, where the stains have long since been polished away, but where the memory of the kingfish still lingers like the echo of a brass band in an empty hall, reminding us that there is no power on earth that can survive the collision with a single, determined, and entirely insignificant bullet. Chapter 18. The Flight of the Great Flying Boat. There is a particular kind of restlessness that haunts the human species, a sort of evolutionary itch that makes a man stare at the horizon and conclude, with an unreasonable degree of certainty, that he would be significantly happier if he were somewhere else, and that he would prefer to arrive there faster than the good Lord or the prevailing winds ever intended. We are a race of travelers who are never quite satisfied with the ground beneath our feet, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the mid-30s, a decade that spent its leisure hours trying to figure out how to fold the map of the world into a shape that would fit in a coat pocket. By the autumn of 1935, the great brooding expanse of the Pacific Ocean, that watery desert that had kept the East and the West in a state of comfortable oceanic isolation, was finally being addressed by the engineers of Pan American Airways. They had built a machine, a colossal, lumbering, and entirely magnificent creature of aluminum and ego, known as the China Clipper. It was not a boat, for it spent its time in the clouds, and it was not truly a plane, for it felt more like a flying ocean liner that had mistakenly decided to trade the waves for the winds. To see the China Clipper resting on the choppy waters of San Francisco Bay was to witness a triumph of human stubbornness. It was a Martin M130, a flying boat with wings that seemed to span the better part of a city block and a hull that was sturdy enough to withstand the rough and tumble of the Pacific swell. It looked for all the world like a giant, silver-plated goose that had eaten entirely too many rivets and had developed a mechanical ambition that surpassed its natural instincts. When the beast lifted off from the water, a process that involved a great deal of spray, a considerable amount of engine noise, and the collective prayers of everyone watching from the dock, it began a journey that was, in its own way, a rewriting of the geography of the planet. It was to carry the mail, the passengers, and the prestige of the American empire from the fog-drenched shores of California all the way to the teeming ancient streets of Manila. It was a route that traversed the very heart of the great empty middle of the world, stopping at places like Honolulu, Midway, Wake Island, and Guam, outposts of sand and solitude that had previously known nothing more than the occasional passing of a fishing boat or the quiet, relentless rhythm of the tide. The absurdity of the enterprise was, quite frankly, a thing of beauty. We had spent centuries struggling to cross the Pacific, enduring the scurvy, the doldrums, and the navigational errors of captains who thought the stars were just decorative lights. Now, we had decided that the best way to handle this vast, indifferent abyss was to skip across the top of it in a metal shell, carrying a cargo of postcards, business letters, and perhaps a crate or two of fancy groceries for the missionaries in the Orient. It was the ultimate high-speed delivery service for things that, in all likelihood, nobody actually needed in a hurry. The passengers who climbed aboard this mechanical albatross were treated to a level of luxury that made the rugged realities of the flight feel like a grand atmospheric misunderstanding. There were upholstered chairs that reclined, there were white-jacketed stewards serving hot meals on china plates, and there were sleeping berths that allowed one to drift off while suspended 10,000 feet above the dark, hungry currents of the sea. It was a theater of the future, a place where one could sip a cup of tea while looking down at a shark-infested blue void and feel for all the world as if one were simply sitting in a very quiet, very well-appointed parlor in the middle of a thunderstorm. But beneath the comfort of the cabin, the reality of the flight was a grueling, heart-pounding, and terrifying test of human endurance and mechanical perfection. The pilots had to navigate by the seat of their pants, by the stars, and by the sheer, stubborn conviction that the engine would keep turning. There was no radar to guide them, no radio beam to hold their hand, and no comfortable Plan B should the ocean decide to reach up and claim its due. They were flying into the unknown, navigating by the flickers of light in the sky and the steady rhythmic roar of the propellers. When the clipper touched down in Manila, the reception was something to behold. The people of the Orient, who had been connected to the American West by a slow, plodding chain of steamships for generations, suddenly found that the world had shrunk by an order of magnitude. The vastness of the Pacific, that great dividing barrier, had been reduced to a matter of a few days' transit. It was as if the globe had been put through a wringer and emerged slightly smaller, a little tighter, and much more tightly stitched together. The critics, of course, were quick to point out the dangers, the costs, and the utter ridiculous expense of the whole affair. They argued that the mail could have waited, that the passengers could have traveled by ship, and that the entire project was just a way for the aviation companies to spend the taxpayers' money on giant metal toys. But the public, as they always do when confronted with a new, shiny, and impossibly fast way of going somewhere else, didn't care a fig for the economics. They saw the silver bird in the sky, they heard the hum of the engines, and they felt that same old familiar itch, the desire to be somewhere else, and to get there before the sun went down. There is a profound, slightly melancholic truth in the fact that as soon as we make the world smaller, we find ourselves wishing it were a little bit larger again. We spend our lives building faster ships, faster planes, and faster ways to bridge the distances, and yet, once we have succeeded, we find that the mystery has been drained out of the horizon. When you can fly from California to Manila in a few days, the ocean ceases to be a grand, epic, and terrifying barrier. It becomes a commute. It becomes a place to look down at, to check your watch over, and to complain about if the steward runs out of napkins. We are a species that is addicted to the arrival. We care so much about the destination, the getting there, the landing, the completion of the transit, that we have forgotten how to appreciate the vast, slow, and thoughtful beauty of the in-between. The clipper flight was the beginning of the end of the age of the traveler. It was the birth of the age of the passenger. It was the moment we traded the romantic, slow-motion discovery of the globe for the efficient, sanitized, and perfectly scheduled transit of the modern world. And yet one cannot help but stand in awe of the sheer audacity of it. To take a hunk of metal, to strap on some engines, and to decide that you're going to fly it over the largest body of water on the planet, well, that is a feat of human imagination that deserves a certain amount of respect, even if one suspects that we might have been just as well off staying where we were and sending our postcards by the slow, reliable, and entirely unterrifying ship. The China Clipper set the pace for the rest of the century. It turned the world into a series of stopovers. It created the illusion that the distance between any 2 points on the map is merely a matter of fuel consumption and cabin pressure. It was the year that the Orient came a little closer, that the West looked a little further, and that the entire planet realized it was no longer a vast, fragmented collection of far-flung lands, but a tightly wound, buzzing, and interconnected hive of activity, waiting to be served by the next scheduled flight. We achieved our goal. We shrank the world. And now we spend our days running around in the tiny, compact little globe we created, wondering why we feel so cramped, so anxious, and so perpetually hurried. Perhaps we should have left the Pacific a little wider, the trip a little longer, and the China Clipper a little more of a dream and a little less of a schedule. But then again, that is just the way of the human animal. We are never satisfied until we have conquered the thing we fear, and once we have conquered it, we are never quite sure what to do with the victory. The Clipper flies on, a silver speck against the blue, and we sit here waiting for the mail to arrive, wondering where the time has gone and why the world doesn't feel quite as big as it used to be. Chapter 19. The Labor Day Tempest. The Florida Keys are a string of islands that have spent the last few thousand years trying to decide whether they wish to be land or ocean. And for the most part, the ocean has generally had the better of the argument. It is a place of white sand, turquoise water, and a sun that beats down with the persistence of a tax collector. It is a paradise, provided you are a seagull or a palm tree. If you are a human being with an appetite for permanent structures and a belief in the stability of the horizon, it is, perhaps, a place better suited for a vacation than a life sentence. In the year 1935, the authorities in Washington, having a surfeit of unemployed Great War veterans and a desperate need to keep them occupied, decided that the best way to serve the Republic was to send these poor fellows down to the Keys to build a highway. They were to replace the grand, ambitious, and frequently submerged remnants of Henry Flagler's Overseas Railroad, a project that had originally been built with the optimism of a man who thought he could talk the Atlantic Ocean into behaving itself. It was a folly of the first order, a ribbon of steel and wood stretched across the shallow shoals, constantly fighting a war against the salt air, the tides, and the occasional uninvited visit from the Caribbean storms. By the beginning of September, the veterans were installed in their camps, living in the tents of the modern-day pilgrim, and working on the project with that weary, dogged resignation that marks a man who has seen the world blow up in his face once already. It was Labor Day weekend, a time when the rest of the nation was busy eating ice cream, watching baseball, and celebrating the noble dignity of the working man. The veterans of the Keys were busy doing the work, unaware that the Almighty had prepared a celebration of His own, a celebration that would not feature speeches, parades, or Union picnics, but a demonstration of power that would make the wildest ambitions of man look like the scribblings of a child in the dirt. The storm did not come with a warning. It came with a feeling. The barometer, that sensitive little instrument that usually sits on the wall minding its own business, suddenly dropped with the frantic speed of a stone falling down a well. The birds, who possess a much finer sense of impending doom than any meteorologist with a degree, went quiet. The wind, which had been a steady, companionable breeze, began to catch its breath, pulling back in a long, rattling inhale that made the palm fronds shiver against the dark, bruising purple of the sky. When the tempest finally arrived, it did not bother with the preliminaries. It did not knock. It simply walked through the front door and tore the house down behind it. It was a hurricane of such concentrated howling and absolute malice that it seemed to have been personally offended by the existence of the Florida Keys. It didn't just blow, it boiled. The water of the Gulf and the Atlantic, spurred on by a wind that must have reached the speed of a startled soul, climbed over the islands in a great, foaming, and irresistible wall. The men in the camps, many of whom had faced the gas and the shelling of the Western Front, found themselves staring into a void that made the trenches look like a Sunday afternoon in the park. There was no enemy to shoot at, no trench to hide in, and no general to call for orders. There was only the sound, a sound so massive, so grinding, and so utterly inhuman that it drowned out the very possibility of thought. The railroad tracks, which had survived the storms of the past by the sheer grace of a few lucky years, were now treated like nothing more than a pile of discarded trinkets. The waves lifted the rails, twisted them into shapes that defied the laws of geometry, and tossed them into the mangroves like so many strands of spaghetti. It is a humbling thing to be a human being in the middle of a hurricane. You spend your life building, planning, and rearranging the earth to suit your own comfort, and then the earth, or the wind, or the water decides that it would like to return to the original design, and in a few hours it wipes away the work of a decade with the casual indifference of a housemaid dusting a mantelpiece. The veterans scrambled for what little shelter they could find, but the water, which seemed to be rising from the ground and falling from the sky at the same time, gave them no quarter. The bridges, the work sheds, the supply tents, all of it vanished into the churning black and liquid chaos. By the time the sun crawled back into the sky the next morning, the landscape had been completely rewritten. The islands, usually so distinct and orderly, were now a jumbled, broken mess of driftwood, mud, and the remnants of a human ambition that had been soundly, thoroughly, and humiliatingly rebuked. The Overseas Railroad, that grand, glorious, and doomed experiment, was finished. The tracks were gone. The ties were shattered, and the dream of a highway across the ocean was buried under a foot of sand and a mountain of misery. The loss of life was, as it always is in these moments of divine temper, a matter of cold, hard, and unforgiving arithmetic. Men who had survived the Great War, men who had endured the trenches, the mud, and the mustard gas, were undone by a storm that had no ideology, no malice, and no mercy. They had been sent to build a road, and they had been met by an eraser. There is an irony here, of course, that is almost too sharp to be comfortable. The hurricane struck on Labor Day, the day we set aside to honor the working man, to celebrate his toil, and to acknowledge his contribution to the great humming engine of the nation. And in the Florida Keys, the working man was reminded, in the most violent and unequivocal language possible, that nature does not care for our holidays. It does not care for our dignity. It does not care for our toil. And it certainly does not care for our railroad tracks. It is a force that exists entirely outside the ledger of our concerns, a force that operates on a timetable that has no room for the vanity of the human project. As the rescue parties began to arrive, picking their way through the wreckage and the mud, the scale of the destruction began to dawn on the world. It was not just the railroad that was broken. It was the spirit of the thing. People looked at the photos when they could be taken, and they saw the twisted skeletal remains of the bridges and the tracks, and they felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. They saw that even with our machines, our steel, and our grand soaring ambitions, we are still just children playing with blocks on a beach, and the tide is always, inevitably, coming in. One cannot help but think of Henry Flagler, the man who built the original railroad, standing in his grave and watching as his dream was swept into the Gulf. He had tried to tame the Keys. He had tried to draw a line in the sand and tell the ocean that it could go no further. And for a little while, he had succeeded. He had kept his trains running, his passengers comfortable, and his schedule intact. But nature is the ultimate long-term investor. She is willing to wait 100 years, or 1,000, to reclaim her property, and when she does, she doesn't bother with litigation. She simply destroys the evidence. The Labor Day tempest of 1935 was the end of an era for the Florida Keys. It put a period at the end of the sentence that Flagler had started writing in the early days of the century. It forced the world to acknowledge that there are some places on this earth that are not meant for the heavy, clanking, and entirely terrestrial needs of the human animal. You can build a bridge, you can lay a track, and you can promise your passengers a view of the sunset, but you are only ever a guest of the storm, and the storm has a way of reminding its guests when the party is over. As the years passed, the Keys would be rebuilt, of course. We are a stubborn race. We never learn from the wreckage. We only learn how to build it back better, stronger, and more expensive. But the memory of that day, the sound of the wind, the rise of the water, and the sudden, awful realization that the railroad was no longer a railroad, but a memory, would remain. It is a story that should be told in every engineering school in the country, not as a lesson in how to build, but as a lesson in how to listen. The hurricane of '35 was a sermon delivered by the Almighty, a sermon on the subject of pride, and the text was written in the twisted steel of the overseas railroad. It was a lesson that the veterans, the builders, and the politicians of the day learned in the most expensive schoolhouse of all, the schoolhouse of the abyss. And so the storm passed, the water receded, and the world went back to its business, busy with its next grand project, its next folly, and its next attempt to trick the elements into submission. We are a singular assembly, we humans. We see the wreckage, we weep for the dead, and then as soon as the sun comes out, we reach for our hammers. We sharpen our pencils, and we start to plan the next bridge, perfectly convinced that this time, we will get it right. It is a beautiful, tragic, and entirely hopeless ambition, and God help us, I believe we would be bored to tears if we ever actually succeeded. Chapter 20. The Audit of 35. And so, we arrive at the final page of the ledger, that curious, crowded, and altogether exhausting volume we call the Year of Our Lord, 1935. It is a time-honored custom of the human race to pause at the end of 12 months and attempt to balance the books, as if history were a shopkeeper's account, and we could somehow determine whether we have turned a profit or suffered a loss. We look back at the months that have slipped through our fingers, and we see a landscape littered with the debris of our own ambitions, the dams we have poured, the laws we have scribbled, the heroes we have buried, and the lines we have drawn in the dirt, all in the vain hope that we might somehow make the world sit still long enough for us to understand it. What is the final accounting of this year? If one were to lay it all out upon a table, a difficult task, considering that half of it is made of concrete and the other half is made of smoke, one would find a most perplexing and contradictory assortment of goods. We have spent the year building mountains where God never intended them to be, and we have spent the same year watching the heavens empty their fury upon our flimsy constructions. We have invented the invisible eye of the radar to watch for our enemies, and we have invented the paper rebellion of the paperback to keep our minds from turning into mush. We have seen kings celebrate their jubilees and populists meet their ends in the marble halls of the bayou, and we have seen the common man, in his infinite, exasperating, and marvelous adaptability, try to make a life out of the remnants of the old one. The audit reveals a truth that we are always loath to admit, that progress is a most erratic and temperamental creature. It does not walk in a straight line, nor does it move at a steady pace. It is a creature of fits and starts, one day building a magnificent structure of stone and steel to bring power to the dark places of the earth, and the next day inventing a new bureaucratic instrument of tyranny to make the dark places a little more terrifying. We have reached the point in our development where we can map the clouds, but we cannot map the heart of the neighbor who lives across the street. We can bounce a radio beam off an airplane to detect its approach, but we cannot detect the malice that is gathering in the halls of power until it has already begun to burn the house down. It is a grand experiment, this business of being human, and 1935 has been a particularly vivid chapter in the manual. We have behaved like children, playing with a set of magnificent, dangerous, and entirely uninstruction manual-equipped blocks. We have stacked them high. We have cheered at the height of the tower, and we have looked at the base with a sudden, sinking suspicion that the foundation might not be quite as solid as we had led ourselves to believe. Consider the duality of the year. We have seen the birth of a social contract in Washington, a promise that the state will care for the old, the weary, and the forgotten. It is a noble, humane, and deeply necessary idea. Yet, in the same breath, we have seen the rise of the codifiers in Nuremberg, who have used the same tools of law and registration to transform the neighbor into the outsider, the citizen into the subhuman, and the state into an instrument of organized bureaucratic cruelty. We have seen the capacity of the human spirit to reach across the ocean in a flying boat, and we have seen the capacity of the human spirit to march into a sovereign nation with tanks and mustard gas, all in the name of a past that never really existed and a future that promises nothing but ash. There is no reconciling these things. They exist side by side, like weeds and wildflowers in the same garden, fed by the same rain and the same sun. We are a singular assembly, we humans. We spend our days building a magnificent dam to control a river, and our nights playing a board game to see who can most effectively drive our neighbors into the poorhouse. We are capable of the most exquisite, tender, and profound acts of kindness, and we are capable of the most calculated, cold-blooded, and terrifying acts of indifference. And the frustrating, maddening, and utterly persistent truth is that we are all of these things at once. As the year draws to a close, the wind is beginning to howl a little louder across the Atlantic. The politicians are trading their whispers for shouts, the generals are sharpening their swords, and the great creaking machine of the world is starting to pick up a speed that is entirely out of our control. We are standing on the threshold of something that we can see in the corner of our eye, like a shadow at the end of the hall, but something that we are too polite, too tired, or too busy to acknowledge. We have built our houses, we have paid our dues, and we have convinced ourselves that we are safe, but the ledger is never closed, and the audit is never truly finished. But let us not despair entirely, for there is a resilience in the human animal that no storm, no bureaucrat, and no dictator has yet managed to extinguish. It is the resilience of the man who wakes up in the morning, looks at the mess we have made, and decides to plant another row of corn. It is the resilience of the woman who carries a classic novel in her purse, and in doing so, refuses to let the world turn her into a machine. It is the resilience of the neighbor who, when the world is going to hell in a handbasket, still finds the time to stop, to listen, and to share a bit of human warmth with someone who has been down in the ditch. We are a noisy, messy, and entirely unfinished project. We are not a perfect race, and we are certainly not a logical one. We have made a great deal of trouble for ourselves, and I expect we shall make a great deal more before we are through. But in the midst of it all, there is a pulse, a steady, rhythmic, and entirely human pulse that keeps beating regardless of the score, regardless of the audit, and regardless of the gathering storm. So let us close the ledger for 1935. Let us tuck it away in the shelf of our memories, right alongside the other dusty, forgotten volumes of our history. We have survived the dust storms. We have survived the crash. We have survived the politicians. And we have survived the terrible, beautiful, and utterly confusing experience of being alive for another 12 months. We have learned, if we have been paying attention, that the world is a fragile place, that our hold on it is a tenuous one, and that the only thing that truly matters in the end is the kindness we show to each other while the clock is ticking. The light is fading, the year is ending, and the next one is standing on the doorstep, waiting to be let in. It will bring its own storms, its own dams, its own heroes, and its own fools. It will challenge us in ways we cannot imagine, and it will reward us in ways we do not deserve. But that is the beauty of the thing, isn't it? We don't have to know how it ends. We only have to know how to walk into the dark, one step at a time, with our eyes open, our hearts full, and our wits about us. History is a river, and we are all of us in the boat, rowing as best we can, hoping that the current is kind and that the rapids are not too deep. We have had our turn at the oars in 35, and we have done our share of rowing, steering, and occasionally shouting at the banks. It is time to pass the oars to the next generation, to the next year, to the next turn in the river. Let us hope they have a steady hand, a bit of humor, and a great deal of patience, for they are going to need every bit of it. And so to the reader who has traveled this far through the ledger, keep your coat buttoned, keep your lantern lit, and keep your spirits high. The world is a strange, wild, and altogether magnificent place, and even if it is on a tilt, it is still the only one we've got. We might as well enjoy the ride, even if the destination is a bit of a mystery. After all, what else is a human being for, if not to witness the show, to laugh at the clowns, and to try, in his own small, fumbling way, to make the next act just a little bit better than the last? Good night, 35. You were a piece of work, and I reckon we shall see your like again, though heaven knows we might be better off if we didn't. Onward, then, into the uncertainty.